Calistos, Guardians of Hades Romance Series, Book 5. Written by Felicity Heaton. Narrated by Eric G. Dove. Chapter 9. Calistos? Miranda stepped into the bright, large kitchen. Yeah? He didn't take his head out of the huge double refrigerator that stood against the right wall of the kitchen, at the start of the white cupboards. So his name was Calistos, then. The first piece of information she filed away. The first of many she was determined to get before the night was through. She needed to know if she could trust him, and if he could help her. You mentioned you were from the Underworld. Something she was still finding difficult to believe, even when she now knew that she had been there. That black-walled bedroom she kept seeing had been in that dark realm. Yup. He twisted away from the refrigerator and dumped an armful of ingredients onto the black marble counter of the enormous island. He rifled through them and then paused and lifted his head, looking at her. You got questions about it? She nodded. He waved a hand towards the stools on the other side of the island to him. Take a seat. I'll answer any you have if I can, provided you do the same for me. Miranda nodded again. She couldn't really remember much, so she didn't have much she could tell him. She was getting the better end of the deal. She removed her dirty, sodden coat and tried to figure out where to put it. Everything was immaculate. Wherever she chose to put it, she would ruin something. She settled for holding on to it, trying to ignore how wet it was and how it chilled her. Calistos rounded the island, took it from her, and tossed it onto a Queen Anne wooden dining chair that she hoped wasn't an antique. He caught the grimace on her face as he turned away from the dining table and shrugged it off. Karis would just get them recovered. He might burst a blood vessel about it, but it's on me. And him. I wanted to take you to London. Miranda paused halfway through pulling one of the black and gold stools out from under the lip of the island and looked at him. London? He nodded. That's my gaff. I rule it. Like a king? She doubted that, almost called him on his choice of words, but didn't think it would have any effect if she did. He looked pleased that he apparently ruled London. London, where her father and Cass had told her to go. That feeling that this was the god her father had seen her with, the one she was meant to trust, increased, stirring a need to know more about him and this world she had fallen into, one where she strangely felt she belonged. She pushed up onto the stool as he rounded the island again and watched him as he sorted through the horde of vegetables, packaged meat, and other products he had scattered across the black counter. I'd offer you a glass of wine, but no booze allowed. He shrugged, rolling toned shoulders beneath his dark green t-shirt. Like no human medicine. She canted her head and studied him closely. He nodded as he put several ingredients aside. Messes with us. He flicked her a glance. Might mess with you, too. Miranda shook her head. I've had wine. No ill effect other than a hangover that made me regret giving in to peer pressure. He turned his back to her, went to the cupboards on either side of the stove, and rifled through them. Did it at least taste good? I mean, I've had ambrosia, and that was a real kick. Is it like ambrosia? She wasn't sure what ambrosia was, so she shrugged. Maybe. I like talking to you. He slapped a few cans down on the counter of the island and grinned. Get the feeling you're honest. She liked talking to him, too. Mostly because this all seemed so normal, and it was making her forget what had happened only a few hours ago. And also because he was the first man she had met who she felt comfortable talking to. In fact, she didn't feel nervous at all. He scratched his chin and planted his other hand against his hip, his eyes on the ingredients. A slow smile curled his lips, and his blue eyes glittered with mischief as they landed on a package of duck breasts. Karis would throw a fit, using his fancy food for this. But how about a cassoulet? Her heart missed a beat. Sorrow flooded her, cold and numbing. Tears stung her nose and the backs of her eyes. Did I say something wrong? His face fell. She shook her head. No, just my father used to make me cassoulet when I was younger, whenever I'd had a bad day. And the last few days had been the worst of her life. She didn't want to cry, but the thought of someone making her favorite comfort food for her right now had the tears threatening to come. Well, I guess today qualifies as a bad one. He looked as if he might smile, and then he turned away from her and pulled some drawers out, gathering pans he set on the stove. He didn't know the half of it. I, you know my name, and
Marinda.
she managed a small smile when he looked back at her.
Marinda Pelletier.
Calistos. Just Calistos. But you can call me Cal. He cracked a grin. Calistos is what I get called when someone is pissed at me. 90% of the time, Karis is the one calling me that. From what she recalled about his brother, she could see why. Karis had come across as a serious type, much like her. She had always wanted a sibling, but she couldn't imagine having one as easygoing and playful as Calistos. Maybe it was a little big brother syndrome, too. Karis had looked close to 40, maybe even over 40, while Calistos looked no older than 30. She imagined a 10-year age gap probably made Karis protective of his younger brother. Calistos opened all the ingredients, lifted the oil to put it in the pan, and then looked over his shoulder at her. Before I do this, I need you to do something. She frowned at him, curiosity running through her. What? Swear you won't ever tell my brothers what you witness here. It'll be our secret. None of them think I can cook. Why would he want to keep that from them? He didn't look as if he was going to proceed without her agreeing, so she nodded. He turned his back to her and went to work. Marinda ran over the things her father had said, using the time Calistos wasn't facing her to think about Papa and what had happened. She didn't want Calistos seeing the tears in her eyes, or how deeply her heart hurt as she tried to focus on what her father had told her, and shut out the images of him that accompanied his words. The thing that stuck with her was the fact that all those bedtime stories he had told her apparently weren't stories at all. They were things he had seen. It still sounded incredible and impossible. She had loved those tales, listening to him talking about warriors who had sounded like superheroes to her back then, people who were capable of incredible feats and had awesome powers. If she remembered those stories correctly, she could use them to confirm that her father had been telling the truth, and he had been able to see the future. It would go a long way towards making her feel more comfortable around Calistos, and would make it easier for her to believe him and the things she had learned so far. She picked a place to begin at as Calistos seared the duck breasts and sausage and the other meat he had found in the refrigerator. The smell of it was already delicious, transporting her back to better days. She had talked to her father in their cramped kitchen while he had cooked, unburdening her heart. Now she was going to do the same with this man, and hopefully at the end of their conversation she would believe the things that were happening to her.
You have 6 brothers.
He spun to face her, an incredulous edge to his eyes as he stared at her. What did you just say? She swallowed, suddenly realizing that she probably should have explained a few things first, since he wasn't sure whether she was working for his enemy.
My father told me about you when I was young. I remember the stories, although I thought they were just that, stories.
She tensed when his eyes narrowed on her pulse jacking up despite her attempts to remain calm. Getting flustered was only going to make her appear nervous and even more suspicious.
He said they were the future. I didn't believe that. But now that I'm thinking about them, you have 6 brothers, don't you?
He nodded, lowered the spatula, and looked as if he wanted to say something, but wasn't quite sure where to begin. She beat him to speaking.
Gods who come from a dark realm, each with incredible powers, with a mission. What was it now? Oh, something about protecting people, normal people, people of this world.
Mortals, he said, his tone dark, as serious as she had ever heard it. But not just mortals. We're protecting both worlds. His eyes narrowed on her, suspicion glimmering in them.
I'm telling the truth. I don't lie, and I'm not with your enemy. I don't even know who your enemy is.
Well, for one, there's a few unknowns among them, and the biggest one is a female. She scowled at him.
And you think I'm her?
His frown eased. No, I don't know what you are. She leaned towards him.
My mother came from the Underworld. Papa told me. She died when I was born.
Any idea what species she might have been? He took a step towards her. She shrugged.
I don't know. I thought I was human.
That calculating edge entered his eyes again. When we met in the hospital, what am I asking? You drank the waters. He sighed. Do you remember any of what happened? She frowned as she thought about that night. Her memory of it was still patchy, things still coming back to her.
Some things. Bits and pieces.
Do you remember me speaking a foreign tongue? His stormy eyes searched hers. Miranda pursed her lips and lowered her focus to the kitchen island as she went over everything she could remember about that night, and frowned again as something came to her. She tilted her head back and met his gaze.
I do. I remember you speaking Russian or Greek or something.
Did it hurt you? His fingers flexed and he lifted his hand, hesitated, and then scrubbed it around the back of his neck. Had he wanted to touch her? She shook her head.
I remember other people being in pain. Wait, that was because you spoke that language?
He nodded and his expression turned awkward. I'm not meant to speak it in this world.
I didn't understand it. But then when you took me to the Underworld, I could understand you.
He shrugged. Everyone in my realm understands it, like a universal translator in the air or something. I don't know how it works. What's important is that it didn't hurt you in this world. This time her eyes searched his.
What does that mean?
You're definitely not human. Only people from the underworld aren't hurt by it. My brothers, for example. Gods and goddesses, hell spawn, breeds that live in the underworld. That was no comfort at all. She felt human. She felt the same as she had before. No, she didn't. She wanted to feel the same as she had before her father had died, but she didn't. And she wasn't sure it was just the trauma of losing him that had her feeling different. She pressed a hand to her chest, curled her fingers into the soft material of her top, and tried to keep the cold at bay, not wanting to feel it. Can you think of any reason why those demons attacked you? Calistos' deep voice rolled over her, warming her and then chilling her to the bone when she realized what he had asked.
Demons?
Her eyes widened, ice skating down her spine as she caught flashes of those people who had attacked her. She stared at him as the images gained pace, horrific replays that went from black and white to dreadful color, and yet the blood that soaked her hands was still oily black. Her eyes shot wider, as black and oily as what had been on Calistos when they had brought him into the hospital. Miranda. His voice was close to her and she tensed as his hand came down on her shoulder, shirked his touch and stumbled backwards off the stool, barely keeping her balance as she reared away from him. His fingers flexed, his hand suspended in the air between them as he looked at her, his blue eyes holding an apology. She couldn't breathe. She paced the room, struggling for air as everything whirled in her head again, faster and faster, a collision of violent images that made her sick to her stomach. Her gaze drifted to the two tall sash windows beyond the dining table. The night outside looked darker than it had ever been, set her on edge as she stared at it, aware that out there were things called demons, and they were after her. What if there were more of them? Calistos had fought them, and he had ended up seriously injured. If a warrior god couldn't best them, a man her father had painted as a superhero, what hope did she have? A feeling cemented inside her. She wasn't safe in Paris.
London.
She pivoted to face him.
You mentioned London. I need to go to London. I promised my father I would go there.
What's in London? Calistos canted his head and his blonde eyebrows dipped low, narrowing his blue eyes.
I don't know. I only know I'm meant to be there before my birthday. It was important to him. So important it was the last thing he said to me.
Before he had said that he loved her and had slipped from her life forever. Before you left home? Cal edged a step towards her, his frown deepening. The numbness returned, so the only thing she felt was the pain that burned in her heart, ripping it apart all over again. Her brow furrowed and she couldn't stop the tears from forming.
Before he died.
He grimaced. Shit. I didn't. She brushed past him and slumped onto the stool again.
You didn't know.
She didn't really want to talk about it, not when her heart was hurting so badly. But as Calistos settled onto the stool beside her, she couldn't hold it back.
After what happened at the hospital, I went to see him. I felt something was different, wrong. I couldn't remember things, and something just didn't feel right. I thought it was maybe because I had returned to Paris early from summer break, so I decided to surprise Papa with a visit. When I got there,
Her throat closed up and she tried to clear the lump from it. Cal placed his hand on her shoulder, and this time she didn't push him away. The gentle pressure of his grip was comforting, offering strength that she took as she lifted her gaze from the marble counter and settled it on him.
someone had attacked him, and he was dying. He told me things. How he could see the future, and that his bedtime stories had all been real. And he told me I had to go to London, and I had to trust someone.
She looked into Cal's eyes as that feeling she'd had grew stronger.
I think I meant to trust you.
His eyebrows shot up and he jerked a thumb at himself. Me? Why me?
I don't know.
She couldn't keep the frustration from her voice as she rubbed her forehead.
He just told me to trust you, and that I had to be in London, and that people would be after me.
He had also told her to have faith and be strong. She wasn't sure she could do that, not when everything felt so bleak and a feeling of being doomed constantly pressed down on her. Another flash of black blood and dead demons had her squeezing her eyes shut. That hadn't been her. She wasn't violent. She wasn't like that.
I think there's two of them.
She pushed the words out as she opened her eyes and fixed them on Cal, using him to distract her from her memories and keep her in the present.
On the CCTV footage the police had, 2 men went into the house and only one came out.
And after tonight, she had a suspicion she knew why he had never been caught on camera leaving the house.
I think he disappeared, like your brother did.
Cal bit out a curse and looked away from her. For the first time since meeting him, he looked genuinely worried, and that terrified her. If he was worried, how bad were things?
I know what they look like.
The marble counter went out of focus as she built a mental image of them, pulling up the ones she had seared onto her mind so she would never forget them. As they came into focus, that burning began again, deep in her heart at first. It slowly spread through her like lava in her veins, destroying the cold and the numbness, filling her with a dark and powerful need that she feared would consume her if she didn't fight it. The coldness of her voice shocked her as she said,
I'm going to find them, and I'm going to make them pay. I'm going to avenge my father.
Whoa now, let's not be hasty. Cal's grip on her shoulder tightened as if he feared she might disappear as his brother and that man clearly had. I think shit just crossed a line into damned serious territory and I need to call my brothers. Hurt, so fierce and deep that it stole her breath, crashed over her, extinguishing the fire burning inside her as a thought she kept wanting to shut out hit her again. All those stories her father had told her had been real. He had been able to see the future. Had he been able to see his own death? A chill raised the hairs on her arms, turning her flesh to goosebumps. Your dad was a carrier. Those words had her gaze lifting to Cal as he palmed her shoulder. It's what we call a species that is a sort of descendant of a demigod. I know a few of them. 2 women on our side are carriers. One can heal and the other can read people's minds and their intentions. It sounds like your dad was a seer.
A seer?
It was only a small piece of information, but it comforted her and made her feel closer to him again. It eased some of the hurt in her heart that had bloomed when she had discovered he had kept things from her.
Maybe I'm a carrier?
Cal's handsome face twisted in that way it did whenever he was weighing his options and didn't like any of them. I don't think you are. I mean, you might be. I'd have to ask my brothers. But I have the feeling you're something else. I've never seen anything below Karis in a bad mood cause as much destruction as you did tonight. She did shirk his grip now.
It wasn't me.
Cal held both hands up beside his head. Okay, I'm sorry. He looked her over, a flicker of worry in his eyes, or possibly fear. Did he think she would hurt him if he upset her? Was he afraid of her? She didn't like the thought that he might be, so she mumbled,
I'm sorry, too. I just don't want to think about that.
He nodded. Got it. He lifted his hand and she felt she should stop him, but as his palm came to rest gently against her cheek and the warmth of it seeped into her, she fell into his blue eyes instead. A haziness came over her as she charted the subtle flecks of gray and white in his irises, and the pull she had felt towards him in the hospital tugged at her again. She leaned closer to him, lost and adrift, but unafraid because she felt as if she was home. His voice dropped to a low whisper as he stroked his thumb over her cheek, his eyes darting between hers. I'm meant to be making you feel better, but I think all I've done has made things worse. I'm a terrible host. When she shook her head, his hand slipped lower, brushing her jaw before it teased her neck, sending a shiver through her that felt all too pleasant. His gaze dropped to her body. I am. Look, I'm letting you sit here in wet clothes. You'll probably catch a cold and my brothers will kill me. He slipped from the stool. His hand slipped from her neck, sending another shiver rolling through her, one that stirred heat inside her. She tried to shake that feeling away, but it lingered, spread to warm every inch of her, and that set her on edge. He might be handsome, charming in his own way, but she wasn't going to fall under his spell like all the other women he chased did. He was a player, and that meant he wasn't her type. She wanted a forever sort of love like her father and mother had shared. Cal offered his hand. When she only looked at it, he said, I'm not trying anything. I just figured maybe a nice hot shower will warm you up and make you feel better. You can have one in my room while I'm cooking your meal. There's plenty of time. As nervous as she should have been about showering in a strange apartment while there was a man in it, a man she found attractive, she found the idea too appealing to turn it down. She eased down onto her feet but didn't take his hand, mostly because she didn't trust herself. She had been attracted to men before, but had never acted on it, and she wouldn't be acting on it now either. This was no time to let lust get the better of her. What she needed right now was information, a clear head, and to focus on her predicament, treating it with the seriousness it deserved given that her life was at stake. She made the mistake of looking up into his eyes. Hers locked with them, and the heat in her veins cranked up another degree. Apparently, her body had a different idea to her mind about what she needed. Miranda managed to tear her gaze away from his, turning her cheek to him. Out of the corner of her eye, he looked at the hand she had rejected, rubbed it on his jeans, and headed for the living room. Miranda followed him through it to a room that had the biggest bed she had ever seen. Dark blue satin covered it, a contrast to the white metal frame. A bed that looked homely, but also made for wicked things. He walked between it and the twin oak wardrobes that took up barely any wall space, and opened the door that filled the gap between two dressers, revealing white tiles and a sink. Everything you might need is in there. He stepped away from the door. You can change clothes, too. Grab anything you want. Or... He strode past her, leaving the room. When he came back, he was holding her backpack. She had forgotten about it. As soon as he was near to her, she grabbed it from him and held it to her chest, came close to cursing as she saw the front pocket was torn. Cal moved, dragging her focus to him, and the phone he had pulled from his pocket.
I lost my phone.
She pointed at the one he held.
Can I use that? I need to call someone.
Who? His blue eyes narrowed on her.
I was meant to meet my guardian, Cass, in London. I missed the train tonight because... And I need to speak to her. Please?
She was sure that Cass would be worried about her, and she needed to set her mind at ease. His eyes narrowed further, and his irises turned stormy. You can't tell her anything about this. About me. He moved the hand he held the phone in behind his back.
But Cass will know what to do.
Because since Miranda was a child, before Cass had returned home, her closest friend and the woman who was like a mother to her had always known exactly what to do. And now she had the feeling that Cass knew things about her and about her father.
Swear to the gods.
And maybe, just maybe, Cass knew about Cal and his brothers, too. A breeze whirled around her, stirring the drying strands of her hair and his ponytail, and she felt sure he was the cause of it, and she was the reason behind the sudden change in his mood. She just wasn't sure why. He tossed the phone onto the bed rather than handing it to her. Call her then, but I'm not leaving this room, and if you say anything I don't like... He didn't finish that threat. He didn't need to. She got the hint. Not that it made a difference to what she was going to say. She only wanted to tell Cass that she wouldn't be able to meet her in London. Not right now, anyway. She had the feeling that Cal could help her find her father's killers, and she was going to make him do just that. She would be in London before her birthday, so whatever her father had foreseen could come to pass. But right now, she needed to avenge him. Chapter 10. Rather than listening in on Miranda's conversation and coming across as an overbearing, untrusting dick, Cal gave her some privacy. The meat was probably ruined by now, or at least in dire need of his attention. He did his best not to strain to hear her as he strode across the living room to the kitchen and switched on the radio. He focused on cooking, but it was hard when his focus kept drifting back to his bedroom and the beautiful blonde currently occupying it. A woman he felt drawn to now more than ever. The revelation of what her father had been and that her mother was potentially something powerful from the underworld, the anguish she had shown about losing her memories, and the fear he had caught in her eyes whenever she had thought about what she had done. It had all combined to provoke a reaction from him that still had him off balance. He flexed the fingers of his right hand, swore his palm was still warm from the soft touch of her cheek against it. His heart thundered as it had when he had looked into her eyes, and he glanced over his shoulder towards his room. Had she experienced the same zing in her blood, a fierce attraction that gripped and refused to let go? He forced his focus back to cooking. It was just lust. It had been weeks since he had been with a woman, and then she had crashed into his life, smelling like sweet roses and lilac, and he couldn't get his damned mind off her. As time trickled past, a thought popped into his head. He did like her, though. He smiled as he tipped the meat into the dish, added beans and more ingredients, and heated them. She had strength, a hidden sort. With everything that had happened to her, she should have been on her knees, but she was still standing, and she was willing to face whatever awaited her, which he suspected was his enemy. Had he pulled her into his mess? Gods, he hoped he hadn't. He couldn't bear the thought of getting someone he liked into trouble, and he couldn't shake the fear that plagued him, had set up home in his heart and was already festering there. She was going to end up dead, too, and it would be all his fault again. He closed his eyes and breathed as fire ricocheted around his mind, broken veins of it bright in the darkness. His head throbbed, and he rubbed his temple with his left hand, trying to ease the ache as it built. "Let it go," he breathed. He inhaled slowly through his nose, and then out through his mouth, repeated it again and again, filling his lungs each time. She wasn't going to end up dead because of him. He would make sure of that. Although the way she had handled those demons said she didn't need his help. Or maybe she did. If she couldn't remember it, then she had blacked out when it had happened, which was troublesome and just a little bit worrying. Escher couldn't remember the things he did when his other side was in control. Did she have a dual personality like his brother did? He set the casserole dish into the oven, grabbed the phone from the wall, and speed-dialed Karis, who didn't answer. Either he had really pissed his brother off with his flippant remark about Ennio, or Karis was indisposed. He tried Ares next. His second oldest brother picked up on the first ring, his gruff baritone loud and holding a hint of alarm. "Karis?" "No, just me." Cal rounded the island and leaned his backside against a stool. "Karis dumped Paris on me for a few days since our new development wasn't fit for travel. She's using my phone right now. What happened with Karis?" Ares huffed. "Went off in a bad mood. You kicked the hornet's nest and we all got stung for it, so thanks for that." Cal grimaced. "Sorry. He was really grinding my gears. Should have considered the consequences." "You never do. Why start now?" Ares grumbled, and Cal bit his tongue, stopping himself from bringing up all the times Ares acted without thinking, which was around 10 times a day. "Is that Cal?" Merrick's warm voice sounded in the distance. "Yeah. I think he's calling for backup. Can't handle a little human." Ares was grinning. Cal knew it, and he wanted to step to Seville or wherever his two brothers were and punch it off his face, which would only end with him getting third-degree burns since Ares would lose his temper and his power over fire would act up, manifesting itself to cause a wall of deadly heat around his brother. Sometimes Cal wondered how Megan, Ares' wife, was immune to his flames. Some of his brothers suspected she was closer to her demigod ancestor than most carriers, giving her the power to resist being harmed by Ares' flames and Diamond's ice. I can handle her, but she isn't human. Cal relished the stunned silence that followed, wallowed in it for a while. It wasn't every day he knew something that Ares and Merrick didn't. What do you mean she isn't human? Ares said. Not down the phone. Cal jumped off the stool and whirled to face his brother where he filled the space on the other side of the kitchen island, his rough features set in a scowl that had his brown eyes gaining red flickers of fire. Ares lowered his gaze, tilting his head downwards, causing strands of his overlong tawny hair to fall forwards, and drawing Cal's focus there. His brother's thumb danced over the screen of his phone. What are you doing? Cal took a step towards him. Calling a meeting. Ares set his phone down on the black marble counter, and Cal wanted to throttle him. He had wanted to talk to his brothers, but he hadn't wanted it to happen here where Miranda was. She was handling things well, but he wasn't sure how well she would handle being faced with 5 or possibly all 6 of his brothers at once. Merrick appeared near the dining table. He brushed away the wisps of black smoke on his dark linen shirt and trousers, a lingering after effect of the teleport, and his deep brown eyes settled on Ares. Was wondering where you disappeared to, old man. I dropped Katerina in Scotland. She's hoping tonight she'll be able to get Guillaume to talk. Merrick looked at Cal as he moved to stand beside Ares. They could have been twins if it weren't for the subtle differences in their height and the color of their eyes. Merrick's hair was a shade darker brown than Ares', too. The thick waves of it kept tamed while Ares let his tawny locks reach his broad shoulders, preferring to wear them back in a thong. Merrick also preferred linen clothing suited to the climate of Seville, only wore combat gear when on patrol. Ares dressed like he was going biking 24/7, matching black jeans and t-shirts with leather boots made for kicking ass. Do we have a problem? Merrick said. Just as Escher appeared in the room, the ribbons of shadows that swirled around him only adding to the imposing sight of him, as his navy eyes scanned the room and settled heavily on Cal. Yes, we have a problem, Cal barked at Ares. You invited a problem. Escher's black eyebrows rose high on his forehead. I'm a problem? His older brother blinked and looked to Ares and Merrick, worry surfacing in his eyes as he sought an answer to that question. Just cool your shit and don't hurt her. Cal eased a step backwards towards the door to the living room, placing himself in Escher's path. Escher looked even more confused. Why am I meant to be cooling my shit? Ares shrugged. Merrick pulled a face that said he didn't have a clue. Cal spelled it out for his brothers. Anyone touches her? Oh, how sweet. Ares grinned at Merrick and nudged him in the ribs with his elbow. Cal has a crush. I do not. The denial sounded weak even to his ears and did nothing to stop Ares from waggling his eyebrows at Merrick. Who has a crush? Valen just had to choose that moment to walk into the room behind him. Sorry, misread the message. Presumed we were meeting in the living room. Damn, what smells good? Fuck, Cal had forgotten about the cassoulet. Nothing. He wanted to shove Escher aside so he could reach the oven and check on it, but he didn't want to leave his post at the door, or draw attention to the fact he had been cooking, something he had always denied he could do. Mostly because anything he did, his brothers found endearing and also source material for ripping into him. Cal has a crush. Although admitting he could cook was looking like a good way of getting Ares off that subject. I don't have a fucking crush. Cal glared at Escher. Didn't mean to hit him with the full force of his anger, but his mind was on reaching that damned oven before someone checked it. Could he pretend Miranda had cooked it? You. He pointed a finger at Escher, whose right eyebrow arched as he paused halfway through pushing the longer strands of his inky hair out of his left eye. Stay there. Do not, and I repeat, do not even think about hurting her. Hurting who? Escher looked close to attacking him rather than Miranda. I don't feel like hurting anyone right now, but you're pushing it, little brother. You don't. Cal just stared at him. That isn't possible. Unless... The woman isn't human? Ares offered. I know I said that, but I figured because her father had been a carrier, Escher would lose his shit, like he did with Megan. Escher pursed his lips, his black eyebrows rose, and the overlong top of his hair swayed as his head bobbed side to side, as if he was deliberating something. I get that. Megan and Iko feel human to me. But whoever else is in this apartment, they are in no way human. Which was no comfort at all. Hellspawn. Merrick tossed a subtle look at Valen. Cal pivoted and leveled a glare on his violet-haired brother before he could move a muscle to obey that silent command to find her. Don't even think about it. She's in the shower and she's had a bad day. Believe me, the last thing she needs to see is your ugly mug. Valen petted the thick web of scar tissue that ran down his cheek to his collarbone. Eva likes it. Eva needs her eyes checked, Cal snapped, grinning inside as Valen's golden eyes flashed dangerously. Out of all of his brothers, Valen was the one he loved jerking around with the most. Valen grinned at him. You're just jealous because I'm better looking than you and you think your new girlfriend will want to trade up. That hit a little too close to the mark. But it wasn't Valen he was worried about. He couldn't shake the way Miranda had looked at Karis. A black snarl peeled from his lips. I don't have a crush on her. The denial sounded even weaker this time, unsettling him, so he tried changing the subject instead. Where's Diamond? Hong Kong, relaxing. He pulled cleanup duty. Your girlfriend left one hell of a mess behind. Aries' lips twitched as Cal glared at him, daring him to keep calling her that. The last thing he needed was her hearing his brothers speaking about her like she was a conquest. He froze. When had he started thinking about her as anything else? She was living and breathing information, a complication in their plans, and very possibly a short-term dance partner for saucy late-night tangos. That was all. Still, his chances of convincing her to surrender to him for some dancing lessons would be 0 to none if she got out of the shower to find his brothers still here. So he relayed all the vital information she had given him, trusting that Karis had at least done his part, and filled his brothers in on how they had found her, and the things Cal had told him then. Whenever he talked about Miranda, he kept it light and on topic, because he was damned if he was giving his brothers any more ammunition against him in that department by letting them see that she affected him. He stopped when he reached the reason he had wanted to speak with his brothers. I still think everyone should be here. Cal looked at his brothers. I tried calling Karis. Aries leaned back against the work surface that ran across the top of all the cupboards and folded his arms across his chest. Let him be off-grid for now. He just needs some time. Everything that is happening is taking a toll on him. Cal could understand that. It wasn't just that Karis was their leader, having to deal with everything and bearing the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. It was that Enyo kept contacting Merrick, choosing to speak with another brother, not him. Cal wasn't one for love. Love was pain he didn't need in his life. Karis was proof of that. He obviously loved Enyo, and he suffered for it. I was worried I dragged her into this when I took her to the Underworld. Cal glanced at Merrick, who scrubbed a hand around the nape of his neck, and then Valen, who looked just as uncomfortable, and finally Escher. His brother's eyes were black as midnight, and Cal regretted bringing up the Underworld. Escher hadn't been the same since the enemy had killed Iko, and he'd had to go to the Underworld to get her soul back. But what she told me about her father, and the fact that she took out so many demons, and now with Escher saying she really isn't human. Cal drew down a deep breath. I think there's a reason she has a target on her back, and that reason isn't me. I don't know why they want her, but I do know one thing. He looked at all his brothers in turn, assessing their grave faces as they waited, aware that what he was about to put out there was little more than an educated guess. But he needed it out there. I think I know who killed her father. Chapter 11. I think I know who killed her father. Miranda launched into the room upon hearing that, unable to stop herself as those words registered and that burning began again, rapidly rolling to an inferno that scoured her insides. Say that again, she barked, her focus locked on Calistos where he stood in the middle of the elegant black and white kitchen. She stalked towards him, fury mounting inside her, that dreadful cold building once more. You know who killed Papa? Who? I need to know. Her breaths came faster, her heart drumming so quickly that her head felt light, as if she might pass out. Darkness seeped into the corners of her vision and bled into crimson. Rage condensed inside her into something terrifying, a dark need to kill. "Calm your tits, sweetheart." He tossed her an easy smile, one that had her rage boiling hotter in her veins. Because he wasn't taking her seriously. Because he took nothing seriously. Well, that was about to change. Miranda lunged for him, a prisoner in her own body, as she watched her hand launching towards him, on a collision course with his throat. The thought of seizing hold of it sent a pleasant shiver through her cold body. Someone grabbed her arm and twisted it behind her. She reacted on instinct, spun the opposite way, breaking free of his grip, and slammed the flat of her palm onto his chest. Rather than just staggering backwards and falling on his bottom, he flew across the room and crashed into the wall near the door to land hard on the floor. Holy fucking hell! The violet-haired man shook off the blow and pushed back onto his feet, eyeing her warily. His golden gaze flicked to beyond her. "I'm all for strong women, but what in our Father's good name is she?" Someone moved on the edge of her senses. They sharpened and she gasped as everything came into brilliant focus. Some sort of internal radar pinging more than just Cal and this bastard in the room. There were 3 other men, too, all of them powerful. That ice burned colder inside her, firing instincts that she battled as they led her down dangerous, horrifying paths. She fought for air, for control over her body, struggling against the desires running rampant through her. She wasn't violent. This wasn't her. She tossed a desperate look at Cal. His blue eyes softened, his expression turning serious as her gaze met his, revealing the side of him she preferred. "Just breathe, Miranda. You need to calm down. You're getting overwrought, and I'm thinking that's a bad thing." He was right. Bad things happened when she panicked. And boy was she panicking now she had found herself in a room with 5 powerful gods. The gods her father had told her about. Merciless warriors trained in battle from an early age, each possessing control over an element they could use with devastating effect in a fight. She flexed her fingers and tried to breathe more slowly, but her heart refused to settle and the rage over what she had heard Calistos say wouldn't abate. Fear took the helm, overruling the panic and threatening to send her into a tailspin. She didn't want to black out, not again. She tried to breathe, but each rasping inhalation she managed did nothing to calm her. Cal slowly eased a step towards her, his hands coming up beside his chest as she narrowed her gaze on him. Instinct pushed her to lash out. Miranda gritted her teeth and fought to contain it. She didn't want to hurt him. She didn't want to hurt anyone. "Gonna breathe with me now, got it?" Cal risked another step and she wanted to tell him to stop, to run, to get away from her because she wasn't sure she could stop herself. The twisted needs rising inside her were too powerful to deny. It was only a matter of time before something snapped. "Just breathe, like me, deep, slow breath in. Hold it and exhale. You can do it." Cal's lips curled into a faint smile. Her gaze leaped around the room, settling briefly on the 3 other men before her. The black-haired one to her right looked ready to kill her. His blue eyes narrowed on her, rapidly darkening. She swallowed. Cal moved another step closer, dragging her gaze back to him. "Just focus on me and ignore these dickheads." "Dickheads?" someone muttered, possibly the violet-haired one. "Speak for yourself." "No one is going to hurt you," Cal continued as if he hadn't spoken. She didn't believe that. These men thought she was a potential enemy. It was there on all their faces. They didn't trust her. She certainly didn't trust them. She looked at Cal, but she did trust him. As he moved closer, the hold her rage had on her began to fade little by little, as if his proximity was loosening it, freeing her. She finally managed to breathe again, pulling down slow, deep breaths that had the strange cold fire slowly abating, allowing her to claw back control and master her twisted instincts. Behind Cal, a huge man with overlong tawny hair threaded with gold leaned towards a darker-haired man, his warm brown eyes remaining on her as he spoke with him. "You seen that?" The darker-haired man nodded. "Never seen eyes like those before." Eyes like those? Panic spiked right back up, had her hands flying to her face as it struck her that he was talking about her eyes. Cal's face twisted and his blue gaze slid to his right towards the men. Not helping. When his focus settled on her again, his eyes lost all the hardness they had gained, softening and warming as he whispered, "Your eyes are pretty. Ignore them." She couldn't because she had the horrible feeling her eyes were different. She threw a glance around the room, froze when it hit the mirrored glass front of the oven mounted in the cupboards behind Cal. She shoved past him and he snagged her wrist, but he was too late to stop her from catching her reflection. Miranda stared wide-eyed at herself, at her black-ringed, bright violet irises.
What the?
She staggered backwards into the island counter and her legs gave out. Cal's grip on her arm tightened, stopping her from hitting the tiles. He pulled her up onto her feet and held her waist, supporting her as he eased her back to rest against the island. "Don't worry about it for now." He lifted his right hand, looked as if he wanted to cup her cheek as he had before when comforting her, and then glanced at the other men and dropped his hand to his side. For a dreadful moment, she thought he was going to make another flippant remark to cover whatever he was feeling, concealing it from these men. "You okay?" He flexed his fingers, and part of her wished he would touch her. She nodded, trying not to catch her reflection in the oven as she breathed slowly. She fixed her eyes on his, allowed herself to fall into them and shut out the world. There was only him and her, no one else. Nothing else mattered but the connection that bloomed between them, reviving that sensation she had whenever she was near him. Home. Here, with his hand gently shifting from the island counter to brush her waist, heat in his eyes as he inched closer, her gaze in danger of falling to his lips, she was home. "Is he gonna kiss her? Because I might puke." Cal reared back as if someone had slapped him. A hint of color climbed his cheeks, and he cleared his throat as he casually swept a hand over his blonde hair and down the length of his ponytail. She wasn't sure where to look as she grew aware of the other men in the room, how their focus shifted between her and Cal, expectation weighing heavily in the air. "I wasn't," Cal blurted when she finally found the courage to look at him. He shook his head, shrugged stiffly, and then jammed his hands into his jeans pockets. I wasn't gonna kiss you or anything. I mean, I was just—" "She had something in her eye?" The big, gruff, tawny-haired one offered that with a grin. "Fuck off." Cal spat in his direction and looked for all the world as if he was considering landing a blow on the man who was twice his size and then some.
Can we not?
She lifted her hands and rubbed her temples as she closed her eyes, a killer headache building behind them.
No violence.
Because she feared that it would provoke that other side of her, the one she could no longer deny was real. "No violence," Cal said softly, a promise in those words, and his hand grazed her hip, sending a hot thrill through her that obliterated the last of the lingering cold. "Ought to live by your own rules, missy." She cracked her eyes open and risked a glance at the violet-haired man she had tossed across the room. His golden eyes were bright, adding to his dangerous look. She really didn't want to get into a fight with him. She wasn't sure she would make it out alive if they came to blows.
Sorry,
she mumbled, and then put some force behind her words, because according to her father, these warrior gods valued strength. She didn't want to look weak around them, even when she felt it, was deeply aware of how powerful they were, thanks to her new nifty internal radar.
I didn't mean it. It was instinct.
He hiked his shoulders. Whatever. Not like it hurt. Nothing broken. She had the feeling he was like Cal, always attempting to let things roll off his back and pretend they didn't bother him, always masking his real feelings. You said you got a good look at your father's attackers, that there was CCTV footage? Cal pulled her back to him and she nodded.
The police have it,
she said. He glanced at the two large men standing to her left in the main part of the kitchen. Merrick, you think you could get hold of that footage? Merrick, the one with the short, dark, wavy hair, who looked as if he had just come from a beach vacation in his dark linen shirt and trousers, pursed his lips, a pensive edge to his roughly handsome features, and then nodded. Possibly. I can give it my best shot. I just need to know which station has the footage on their servers. She told him the name of it and then looked back at Cal.
What good is that footage to you?
We're looking for someone else who might be involved with our enemy, but we don't know what he looks like. You mentioned a man went into the house with him and never came out. Cal inched closer until she could feel the heat of his body, and a need to tell him to take a step back ran through her. She couldn't concentrate when he was this close to her, making her aware of his body, how his hips were trim but his torso was packed with muscle. Her fingers itched with a need to stroke over his corded right forearm, tracing the blue ink on the inside of it. Ink she remembered shining with blue light. Miranda? Cal's voice rang in her ears, distant as her gaze drifted down his biceps to his forearm. Is she gonna kiss him? Because I'd probably still puke. Someone made a retching noise, snapping Miranda back to the room as effectively as a bucket of ice tipped over her head.
The first man wore a suit. He was tall and the suit looked expensive. Tailored. He wore a hat, too. I think he might have had dark hair. And his eyes.
She trailed off as she remembered the way he had looked at the camera, staring into it, as if he had known she would see him, as if he had wanted her to see him, to be able to recognize him. She looked at the violet-haired one as he came to stand near the one with black hair who was still looking at her with a hunger for violence in his blue eyes.
He had eyes like yours.
She stared into his golden ones. They're my best asset. The man fluffed up the longer lengths of his purple hair. She turned back to Cal, ignoring the man's playfulness.
The other man wore a long black-fitted coat. He was tall, too, and slim. He had black hair, but I didn't get a good look at his face. The other man obscured him most of the time.
She hesitated. What is it? Cal asked. She shrugged but couldn't let it go unsaid.
I think he wanted me to see him. The man with the golden eyes. He looked right at the camera. Not a glance. He stared at it for almost a minute. So I couldn't miss his face. So I couldn't forget it.
He wants you to go after him. The bigger man's gaze came to land on her, and he pushed away from the counter, unfurling to his full height. She felt tiny as he towered over her, at least 2 inches taller than Merrick and twice that over Cal. Can you think of any reason why? She shook her head and broke into French as everything pressed down on her again, pushing her to her limit as panic surfaced once more.
No. Up until 2 days ago, I thought I was human. Now I don't know what I am, and my father is dead. And things called demons tried to kill me, and 2 killers are after me. And I'm in a room with 5 gods of the underworld, and I think I'm going to pass out.
You're not going to pass out. Cal spoke in English, placed his hands on her arms and rubbed them through her jumper. You just gotta breathe. We'll find out what you are, and we'll find those men, and they'll pay for what they did to you. We'll keep you safe. Miranda got stuck on the part about making them pay. That cold stirred inside her again, and a feeling spread through her, one that disturbed her. She was pleased. She shoved back against it, aware that her mind was about to traverse paths she didn't want to entertain. They weren't like her at all. She wasn't violent. She wasn't. Cal turned to his brothers. It sounds like the Wraith, right? Merrick nodded, and the one beside him followed suit. The black-haired one's blue eyes looked onyx as he glared at the floor, his lips compressed into a thin line. Escher? The violet-haired man touched his shoulder. We're all good. Escher jerked his shoulder back, dislodging him. I want him dead, Valen. Valen nodded. And he will be. Just gotta be patient a little longer, man. Escher bared teeth at him, canines that resembled short fangs. I want him dead. His black-ringed eyes snapped to her. They want her. We use her as bait. Miranda gasped. Cal stepped in front of her, his back to her as he held his arms out at his sides. Not gonna happen. Valen, Merrick, back me up here. Ain't gonna happen, bro. Valen shook his head, causing the longer lengths of his violet hair to sway across the right side of his jaw. He rubbed a hand through the short back and sides of it. You know how well it goes when women play bait for us. I have to agree with them. If they want to reach her, they can try, but she stays with us. Merrick drew the tails of his charcoal linen shirt back and slipped his hands into the pockets of his loose-fitting black trousers. That still sounded like being bait to Miranda.
I'm not a worm you can dangle.
She pushed out from behind Cal, and he caught her arm and pressed her back. Valen grinned wickedly. Cal has a dangly worm. Sure, he'd love to show it to you. Heat scalded her face. Cal unleashed what she could only describe as a growl in his brother's direction. Lay off.
You're disgusting.
She spat in French at Valen as she wrenched free of Cal's grip and stormed across the room to the dining table where she intended to remain, as far from Cal as she could get. Hit a sore spot. Valen turned his grin on the other men. The big tawny one sighed, tilted his head back, and pinched his nose. Karras is lucky he isn't here dealing with this immature shit. Who's immature? Valen glared at him. You, everyone answered in unison. Even her. Whatever. Valen lifted his hand, extended his middle finger, and swept it across the room for everyone to see. Even her. Call me when you have something. Until then, my phone will be set to fuck off. He disappeared, leaving eerie black smoke behind. Is it me, or is he getting worse again? The big man looked to his right at Merrick. Merrick pulled another thoughtful face. He's been more on edge since Eva was injured in a fight at the Rome gate. Megan healed her. He dragged a hand down his face, revealing a weary expression as it fell from his stubbled chin. I'm so damn tired. She's up vomiting half the day, and wriggling like crazy the rest of it. I'm getting zero sleep. No rest for the wicked, though, right? The babe is well, though. Escher astounded her as she glanced at him and found concern filling his clear blue eyes. Ares, the babe. The baby is fine. Ares smiled, a reassuring one that almost made her long for a sibling again. Almost. After the way she had seen these men acting tonight, she was grateful she hadn't had one. Just normal sickness. She'll be better soon. The way he said that screamed that he wasn't sure she would be, and that he was genuinely worried about this woman. Someone he clearly loved with all his heart. It was right there in his brown eyes, that same look her father had worn whenever he'd been talking about her mother. It dawned on her that several of them had mentioned women, and for some reason that made her feel a little more relaxed, mostly because it made these gods seem a little more human, a little less scary. I'll let you all know if I manage to get into the server at the police station. Merrick stepped away from Ares and glanced at her. It was nice to meet you, Miranda. He disappeared in a swirl of black smoke before she could respond. I'll call Karras and fill him in. Ares disappeared too. Escher narrowed blue eyes on her. You hurt anyone in this family and I will hunt you to the ends of the underworld. Miranda's spine stiffened, her blood turning to ice as that threat hit her, and she could read in his eyes that he meant it. He disappeared, and she had to admit she was relieved to see him and everyone else go. Dick, Cal muttered. She looked at Cal, catching the concern in his gaze as he stared across the kitchen at her. You okay? He kept his eyes on hers, drilling into her, rousing that awareness of him again, and the fact they were alone now. She swallowed, nodded, twisted the front of her burgundy jumper into her hands.
I'm sorry about what happened. I can't really control myself when whatever it is hits me.
And she hated that feeling of being a passenger in her own body, unable to do anything to stop what was happening. He inched his foot forwards, hesitated, and turned away from her, heading for the oven. It's fine. Like Valen said, no harm, no foul.
It isn't fine.
She tried to swallow the thick lump forming in her throat.
I'm not fine.
How could she be when she didn't know what she was, and when she hadn't recognized her own reflection? Cal looked back over his shoulder at her, steely determination shining in his blue eyes. You will be. Whatever it takes, Miranda. I'll help you find out what you are, and I'll get you through this. Those words were a vow that she believed he meant to keep, even when she wasn't sure that he could. He crossed the room to her, lifted his hand, and didn't hesitate this time. His touch was bliss as his palm landed gently on her cheek, heat flowing through her as he tilted her head back and gazed down into her eyes. His were soft, filling with something she wanted to name but wasn't sure what it was. Not love. This man didn't love, she was sure of that. For some reason, he had closed off his heart, and she was determined to find out why. Chapter 12. Miranda was driving Cal crazy. The huge townhouse felt too small with her in it. He just couldn't escape her. Wherever he went, she was there a few moments later, even in sleep. When he could sleep, that was. Most of the 2 days she had been sharing the house with him, he had lain awake, bone-deep aware of her where she slept in the next room. Karis's room. That wasn't helping matters. He had offered her his own room, but she had refused, opting instead to set up home in his brother's bed. The thought of her sleeping on those sheets that smelled of Caris, his scent rubbing off on her, had him skirting closer and closer to the edge. He growled between gritted teeth as he slapped the orange juice carton down on the counter and crushed it in his fist, sending the ice-cold liquid shooting up like a fountain. Cal bit out a ripe curse as it spilled all over the black marble, ran down the white cupboards, and dripped onto the floor.
Cal?
Miranda's voice came from the living room. He froze, unable to move a muscle as she entered the kitchen, her golden hair a shade darker than before as she rubbed a towel over it. Karis's towel. A conservative wine-red V-neck t-shirt concealed curves he had been fantasizing about non-stop since she had crashed into his life, and her faded blue jeans were loose on her legs, forcing his mind to conjure an image of what they might look like beneath all that saggy fabric. She paused halfway across the room to him, her large blue-green eyes wide and luminous in the afternoon light. She was taking surprisingly well to sleeping during the day like he did, something that was necessary since all gate activity happened at night to avoid mortals seeing them. Water dripped from the ends of her hair, soaking into her t-shirt above her breasts, drawing his gaze to them. Hunger got the better of him, his focus slipping as it flooded him, whipping up 1,000 replays of his wicked dreams of her, and he grimaced as his jeans pinched. "What now?" he barked, a little harsher than intended, and called himself a dick when she flinched. He clenched his jaw and subtly adjusted his hard-on, hoping the height of the kitchen island would give him some privacy so she wouldn't notice what he was doing. It was just lust. He needed to go out and find something fast and fun, a swift fuck to clear his head. He grabbed the paper towels, stooped with another grimace as his jeans tightened painfully over his crotch, and mopped up the spilled orange juice. The scent of roses and lilac hit him, had his dick rock hard in an instant. He froze and lifted his head, his gaze catching on her bare feet just inches from him. His eyes drifted up them, a groan threatening to slip from his lips as he realized just how close she was, and how easy it would be to rise up, wrap his arm around her, and pull her against him. He pushed that urge back down and denied it. He really needed a few minutes' break from her, time enough to find someone to his taste and to purge this pent-up need. Although that meant asking another of his brothers to keep an eye on her, and then there would be questions, and he might end up hurting whoever he left in charge of her. The thought of one of his brothers near her, alone with her, had his mood souring further, pushing him one step closer to the edge. When his mind decided to picture Karis as the one taking care of her, he pretty much flipped his shit. "I'm busy," he snapped, tossed the sodden towels into the sink, and tore more off the roll.
Busy and in a bad mood,
she muttered and moved away from him. Good. He was beginning to see why Valen preferred to be acerbic. It kept people at a distance, and right now he needed some distance from Miranda. Something in the region of his chest called him a liar. He didn't need distance. He needed her as close as he could get her, wrapped up in his arms, her naked limbs tangled with his. His heart beat faster, a rapid drumming against his chest that had his cock throbbing with need. He twisted away from Miranda before she could notice it and cleaned the orange juice off the island.
Are you in a bad mood because of me?
He paused and looked at her. What to say? If he said yes, it would upset her, and she already looked as if she was blaming herself. And he didn't want to upset her. If he said no, she would keep on probing, asking what was wrong until he admitted it was her. He played it safe. Case of blue balls. He grimaced as he let those words fly. Could have picked better ones. Probably should have just blamed his mood on his brothers.
Blue balls?
An adorable crinkle formed between her fair eyebrows. Oh, gods, she would be the death of him, looking all innocent and sweet. I need to get laid. Caustic seemed to do the trick. Stuck here babysitting you, so no action for little cow. Unless... She tossed him a disgusted look and hurried from the room, but he didn't miss the blush that heated her cheeks. He had half a mind to follow her and see if he could convince her that a little fooling around would be a nice way to pass the time until his brothers managed to get hold of the CCTV footage and called a meeting. The other half called him a dick. He settled for finishing cleaning up the spill instead, a sigh escaping him as he listened to her moving around in the living room, muttering things to herself. What was he doing? It wasn't like him to be this wound up about something, and definitely not about a woman. She had him tied in knots, and whenever she was close to him, he couldn't stop himself from bringing up a wall between them, attempting to keep her firmly on the other side of it, away from his heart. Those 4 words hit him with the force of a gorgon in a really bad mood. No, nope, not his heart. That had nothing to do with this. It wasn't getting involved in any way. This was all just the result of a dangerous combination of lust, blue balls, and the most beautiful woman he had ever seen being in his presence 24/7. That was it. He wanted her like he wanted any beautiful woman he met, but he couldn't have her. Why couldn't he have her? He needed a reason. Cal absently palmed his aching shaft through his trousers as he searched for one and set the orange juice carton back in the fridge.
I need to know how Merrick is doing with that.
Miranda's voice cut off. His gaze slowly edged towards her, his lips twisting in a grimace as he caught her staring at his hand. Her cheeks blazed crimson and she stammered,
Would you not do that?
His own cheeks heated when he realized his damned hand was still moving. He yanked it away from his groin and held both hands up beside his head. Miranda's eyes widened and she swiftly turned her back to him.
That only made it worse.
He looked down at his pants tent. He thought it was quite impressive. His own eyes gradually widened as something slowly dawned on him. Unless she couldn't be. A beautiful woman like her? Nah. He stared at the back of her head, rapidly running over how she had reacted each time he had touched her, whenever they had been close to each other the last couple of days, and how sometimes she would keep her head down and hurry away from him as she blushed about something. Maybe that innocent and sweet thing she had going on wasn't just an act. He gritted his teeth, his lips peeling back off them as he grimaced. And now he probably came across as some sex-starved, lust-crazed total pervert. Great, he muttered.
What was that?
She half turned, her cheeks pinkened, and she looked away again.
Look, has your brother been able to get any information yet? I really need to know.
She asked him that 5 times an hour, and it was getting tiring. Coupled with how damned horny he was and that the object of his wildest fantasies was sharing a house with him, and he couldn't bring himself to make a move on her, it was making him seriously cranky. Merrick is doing his best to get into the police system unnoticed, but I told you it'll take a while. Those words came out hard, as sharp as a blade. Merrick will no doubt get it done. The guy's a genius, but he's no hacker. This isn't something he does every day. She whirled to face him.
I need to find them.
Her eyes shone bright, violet-rimmed with obsidian. He splayed his fingers, easing his raised hands toward her as he stiffened, bracing himself in case she lost control. Miranda, I know that. Just be patient. Breathe.
Oh, stop telling me to breathe.
She stormed towards him.
I'm sick of being holed up in this house. I'm sick of knowing they're out there. They murdered my father. They need to pay. You said they would pay.
The violet blazed brighter still. Miranda, he whispered as she squared up to him, all fire and spit, raw fury that was the complete opposite to how she normally was. Hunger blazed in her eyes, need that gave him the oddest feeling that if he so much as twitched right now, she would be on him, and not in a fighting kind of way. That need echoed in his veins, too, drummed in his blood, cranking his temperature up to an unbearable degree, where he was aching for her to step over that line and take what she wanted. But weirdly, he found he didn't really want her like this. That hit him hard, had 1,000 thoughts spinning through his mind that solidified into one clear feeling. He wanted the other Miranda, the sweet, kind, and beautiful soul who abhorred violence. Miranda, he breathed as she stared him down, her chest straining with each inhalation, her pupils dilating to devour the violet of her irises. I'll talk to my brothers, okay? I'll do it right now. I'll set a fire under their arses for you. She blinked, looked down at the small gap between them, and stumbled back a step. Her hand shot to her forehead and she clutched it.
I'm sorry. I just...
The violet faded to blue-green in her irises and she backed off another step.
I...
She pivoted on her heel and rushed from the room. A door slammed a moment later. Cal scrubbed a hand over his mouth and exhaled, able to breathe again as the anticipation leached from him. He needed to talk to Karis. His absentee brother had a lot to answer for right now, and it was time he stepped back in and took control of the team. Plus, maybe Cal would relent and get him to look at Miranda's memories, with her consent. It would be faster than trying to get the footage from the police, and it might go some way towards calming Miranda down and making her feel they were making progress, because she really needed to know they were getting somewhere. Whatever the side of her that emerged from time to time was, it fed off her need for vengeance, and he had the feeling that if he didn't feed it something that satisfied it soon, she was going to go nuclear, and he didn't want that to happen. She feared that side of herself, and he had vowed to help her with it, and he intended to do just that. He strode into the living room, stared at her door, and pulled his phone from his pocket. He dialed Karis. The bastard didn't answer. While Cal was done waiting for him to sort his life out, he stepped, savoring the cool embrace of the underworld as he passed through the link to it, and emerged in the middle of the living room of his townhouse in London. Karis had tidied it. The wooden floor of the pale gray-walled room was empty of the usual scattering of clothes, books, and other things he left on it, and the dark gray couch that faced the fireplace was lacking the sweatpants and hoodie he remembered dumping on it. Cal approached the couch. His brother had even arranged the cushions on it and neatly stacked the magazines on his glass coffee table. The cheek. If Cal wanted a maid, he would hire one. He liked his house the way it was, the complete opposite of Karis's immaculate and sterile home. His brother's voice came from the kitchen door to his right. Cal headed in that direction. "We need to track down the Wraith and the Necromancer soon. Escher won't wait much longer, and we can't have him going off the rails." Ares answered him. "I know. We turn Escher loose and he'll probably kill Eli, and then we're down to only the Necromancer, whoever he is. We need one of them alive if we're going to find out where he's holding Calendria's soul." Pain shot across Cal's mind, 1,000 fragmented fiery streaks that lit it up with an image of a young woman. Her blue eyes were bright with her smile as she bounded away from him and spun, her aquamarine dress flowing outwards from her waist as she pirouetted. Her laughter rang in his ears as she bounced backwards, teasing him as he pursued her, chasing her deeper into the verdant valley of Elysium, with the intent of capturing her and teleporting her before she could get them both into trouble. Again. He gritted his teeth as the scene darkened, his hands flying to his head and the pressure in his skull mounting as he clutched it. His teeth hurt, adding to the pain streaking through his mind as another scene tried to construct itself. He reached for it, laboring for breath as he strained to seize hold of it and bring it into focus, aware that it would slip away if he gave it the chance, aware that if he pushed himself any harder, he would collapse and wake remembering nothing. That had him pulling back on the reins, because he was damned if he was going to forget what he had just heard. He stormed into the kitchen. Both of his brothers swung towards him, shock rippling across their faces. "Cal," Ares started. "You know who killed her." Cal launched himself at Karis, expecting his older brother to defend himself. He didn't. Cal's fist slammed into Karis's jaw, knocking his head to his right. Karis's eyes closed, his nostrils flared as he inhaled, and then he sighed and straightened, looking right at Cal without an ounce of remorse in his green eyes. "You fucking know, and you kept it from me," Cal spat, tears burning his eyes as hurt welled up inside him, shredding him to pieces. He looked at Ares, fury getting the better of him. "How long have you known? How long were you going to lie to my fucking face?" "Not long, Cal. I swear we were going to tell you when we had a solid lead and could help her." Ares pushed away from the black marble counter on the oak cupboards and moved around Karis, coming to stand in front of him, shielding him like a good guard dog. Wind whipped around Cal as his temper mounted, as the hurt boiled down into a seething, twisting thing inside him, a tempest he wanted to unleash on his brothers, because he realized something else, too, something he had only dared to hope was possible before. "Her soul is intact." Those words fell from his lips, rang in his empty mind as he struggled to comprehend that and make himself believe it. "Her soul He looked at Ares, unsure whether to believe what his heart was telling him, and then at Karis. His brothers nodded. "We don't know where it is, though." Ares stretched a hand out to him, his palm facing him. "So we need to do this right. We can't rush into anything, Cal." "No. No way you're gonna stand there and tell me to just let this sick bastard keep her soul caged, tormented." His voice cracked, and the rage that had begun to subside built swiftly again as he thought about how long the enemy had been in possession of her soul, keeping her from entering the afterlife, and that his brothers had allowed that torment to go on longer, doing nothing to save her, to spare her. They hadn't kept everything from him because they had thought it would hurt him, not like that look in Ares' eyes said they had. They hadn't done it to spare him. They had done it to prevent him from attempting to get her back. They had done it to stop him from saving her. The rational part of him whispered that it had been right of them and believed Karis when he spoke. "We were going to tell you when we were sure of everything, Cal. We were going to tell you when we felt confident she could be saved." He couldn't deal with this. It hurt too much, and he was going to unleash that pain on his brothers if he stayed near them any longer. All that mattered was that they had kept something important from him, something they knew would have gone some way towards easing the constant agony that ate away at him each day he lived without her, knowing her death had been his fault, something that gave him hope and a reason to live. "Go fuck yourselves." He stepped before either of them could stop him, landing in the Paris living room in the exact spot he had been before he had left. He pulled his t-shirt off over his head, unfastened his jeans as he strode towards his room and shoved them down. He kicked his boots off, following them with his jeans and his socks, and grabbed a pair of black sweatshorts from his dresser. He couldn't believe they had kept something so important from him. No, he could. And that was the reason he wanted nothing to do with his brothers right now. They were treating him as if he was fragile, a weak little kid who couldn't handle the truth, who would fall apart at the merest mention of his twin sister's name. They always treated him like a kid. Well, he wasn't one. He was a grown man and he was a warrior, and nothing was going to stop him from saving his sister, not even his so-called brothers. He pulled the sweats on and stepped again, appearing on the ground floor of the townhouse, a space Karis had converted into a gym and training room. He strode across the black rubber mats to the punch bag that hung near the corner of the room, rolled his shoulders, and growled as he slammed his right fist into it as hard as he could. The bag swung violently upwards, almost touching the ceiling despite the weight of it. His bare knuckles burned, and he relished the ache. He set a new goal for himself as he gave the bag hell, raining blow after blow down on it, striking it the moment it was back within reach. Fuck the gates. Fuck his brothers. His mission now was to find the one who had Calendria's soul, beat him to a pulp until he surrendered its location, and free her. "Cal." Karis's voice came from behind him. Cal's hackles rose again. He slammed another left hook into the punch bag, following it with a swift right that knocked it back the other way. Plaster rained down on him. If he kept beating the crap out of the bag, the ceiling was going to give out. But he didn't care. Not his house, not his problem. "Cal." He sensed his brother behind him, pivoted and swung with every ounce of his strength, smashed his fist into Karis's perfect face. "Fuck off!" He followed it with a shove, and Karis casually edged a foot backwards to brace himself, barely moving a muscle, as if Cal's blow had been weak, which really pissed him off. He swiped his hand across his damp forehead and breathed hard as he pushed past Karis, not interested in anything he had to say. Karis appeared in front of him again, swirls of black smoke caressing the shoulders of his onyx shirt. Cal was about to tell him to get out of his face when his brother unbuttoned that shirt, removed it, and carefully folded it. "You want to hit me? So hit me." Karis walked over to one of the benches that stood against the white wall and placed his shirt down on it, following it with his shoes and socks. No way he was serious. The look in his brother's green eyes as he moved to face him again, rolling his shoulders in a way that flexed the muscles of his torso and arms, said he was deadly serious. "It was my decision, Cal." Karis moved to stand a few feet in front of him in the center of the mats and flexed his fingers. "So if you need to take it out on someone, take it out on me. Whatever blows you need to deal, I'll take them. Just get it out of your system and move on, because we can't afford to have you doing something reckless." Cal barely gave him a chance to finish his pretty speech before he landed the first blow, a swift uppercut that knocked Karras's head back and ruined his immaculate black hair, turning the longer lengths into tousled ribbons. Karras blocked his next punch with his left forearm, leaving himself wide open for Cal's left fist. It struck hard, splitting Karras's lip. Karras edged back a step, touched his lip, and frowned at the blood on it. Too far? Apparently not far enough. Karras sucked his finger clean, and while Cal was distracted by the disgusting sight of his brother tasting his own blood, his other fist plowed into the side of Cal's head like a sledgehammer. Cal almost went down, tripped and cursed as he fought for balance and tried to shake off the blow. He glared at his brother when he finally righted himself. "I did not say I wouldn't fight back." Karras readied his fists, and his brother meant to go all out. Nothing held back. He couldn't remember the last time they had fought like this, not since they had left the Underworld 2 centuries ago at least. Cal rubbed the back of his hand across his bloodied lip and grinned. Good, because he wanted a proper fight. He kicked off, feinting left so his brother would lash out in that direction, and then dodging right to land a hard blow on Karras's kidney. His brother grunted, grabbed him around the back of his neck, and twisted with him, slamming him into the mats with enough force to knock the wind from him. Cal rolled onto his back, eased his weight onto his shoulders, and sprang onto his feet. The moment they touched the mats, he twisted at the waist, dropping his upper body as he brought his legs up. Karras blocked it, grabbed his ankle, and pulled him towards him. Nope. A grin stretched Cal's lips, splitting his lower one, as he launched his other leg up and twisted again, using the leverage from Karras holding onto his other one to aid him. He slammed his foot into the side of Karras's head. Pain ricocheted up his bones, and his grin widened as adrenaline surged, mingled with his anger, and gave him one hell of a high. Karras seized his arm, yanked him up, and flipped him. His brother's weight came down on him as his back hit the mats again. All the air burst from his lungs. They burned as he sucked in a breath and wrestled with his brother, landing a rapid series of rabbit punches, the best he could do in the limited space. He cursed when Karras backed off, giving him room again, and stared down at him, waiting for him to pick himself up off the mats. It wasn't a win for his brother. Cal whipped onto his feet again and let his fists do the talking, relishing every blow he landed that sent a sharp thrill through him, and the sting of every one he failed to block. He breathed hard, heart hammering as the fight escalated. Damn, it felt good. Cathartic. He refused to pull his punches, a need to push Karras filling him as he pushed himself to the limit too. Blood streaked Karras's bare chest as he dodged back a step and then lunged forwards, bringing his left fist up in a blow that connected so hard Cal swore he saw stars. The coppery tang of blood grew stronger in his mouth, and he spat it on the floor as he realized they were no longer alone. He flicked a glance at the bottom of the stairs, where Miranda stood, staring at his brother. That jealousy he had been fighting to ignore over the last few days snaked around his heart and squeezed it hard, sinking fangs into it. On a vicious roar, he launched at Karras. Chapter 13. Miranda stopped dead at the foot of the staircase, arrested by the fight taking place in what appeared to be a gym. She had wanted to apologize to Calistos about her behavior, including the fact she couldn't seem to stop bothering him about Merrick. The thought that Cal and his brothers might know one of the men who had killed her father and might be able to point her in their direction gnawed at her, had her awake most days and restless most nights. Even when Cal had gone above and beyond to keep her up to date whenever a message came in on his phone, and had been taking good care of her, making her feel at home. The need to apologize fell to the back of her mind as she watched Cal and Karras. Bare-knuckle boxing. The fight was brutal, like nothing she had ever witnessed before, not even on television. The level of violence was disturbing, had her backing towards the wall and on the verge of going back upstairs. And then Cal looked at her. His blue eyes held a trace of disbelief, and she glanced away before they could lock with hers, and her gaze fell on his brother. Karras was bare from the waist up like Cal, his honed body streaked with sweat and blood, muscles tensing and flexing as he dodged the blow Cal had aimed at him in the second before he had noticed her. On a vicious roar that sounded more beast than man, Cal launched at his brother. The two grappled, both fighting for the upper hand. She flinched as Cal cracked his forehead off Karis's, the dull thwack of their skulls connecting, turning her stomach. Karis didn't react at all. His face remained placid, his eyes emotionless as Cal reared back and landed a hard punch on his jaw, knocking his head to one side. Cal was swift to follow it, his fist slamming into Karis's stomach just above his left hip with enough force to leave a deep red mark. Karis grabbed Cal around the back of his head while he was bent forwards, shoved him down, and brought his knee up, smashing it into Cal's face. When Karis released him, Cal staggered backwards, breathing hard, and then grinned and launched back at his brother, who was ready for him. She grimaced when Karis caught him with a swift right that split the skin on Cal's left cheek. Blood trickled down it. Cal swiped it away and showed no sign of stopping, took another blow to the face as he worked to close the distance between him and his brother and find an opening. Neither looked as if they were going to back down any time soon. Sickness brewed in her stomach as she watched them fight, tearing skin and bruising bone. It was barbaric. "Stop!" She dropped off the bottom stair and risked a step forwards towards them. Neither of them paid attention to her. Both seemed intent on killing each other. Her eyes widened when Cal smashed a fist into Karis's cheek and a cut opened just below a small black birthmark on it. A cut that barely produced a drop of blood before it sealed before her eyes. They didn't miss a beat, Karis throwing a punch that Cal blocked before attempting to land one of his own. There was something seriously wrong with these men. Cass's words haunted her, a warning not to trust them. She had wanted to wait for her guardian here, but as the violence of the fight only began to escalate rather than ebb, that weird feeling triggered inside her, a cold that spread through her and roused a need that terrified her. She wanted to join in. No, not her. Whatever this dormant thing inside her was, it wanted violence. She hated it in any form, refused to surrender to whatever caused that cold feeling inside her, that thing that whispered to her, goading her into hunting her father's killers, demanding justice be served to them. She tunneled her fingers into her hair and pulled it back. She had to get out of here, away from these people. She wanted to know what she was and believed Cal when he said he would help her, but she wanted nothing to do with what they were doing. She didn't want to be attacked again. She didn't want to be bait, as his brothers had suggested, a way of luring their enemy to them. She didn't want to be around this violence that fed the darkness inside her and only made it hungrier. Blacking out had been terrifying, haunted her every second. She didn't want to experience that again, lived in constant fear of it, afraid that she would lose control and would do things she couldn't remember. Terrible things. She still had nightmares about what she had done, twisted replays of what had occurred in that street. Her right hand fell to her chest and she pulled her t-shirt into her fist. She hadn't done that. It was the thing inside her that had done it, the black malevolent thing that bayed for blood. Cal and Karis broke apart, both of them dripping sweat and panting. Karis reached the bench near her first and tossed a towel at Cal, who caught it and rubbed himself down as he came to her. When he smiled, he was missing a tooth. He must have caught the horrified look on her face because he said, "It'll grow back. We heal fast." She wasn't worried about him missing a tooth. She was worried about all the other damage that had been done to him and the fact he had been fighting in the first place, attacking his own flesh and blood.
What was that all about?
She fought the cold, driving it back, refusing to let it spread and consume her. The fight was over. No more violence. Just Cal looking as if someone had run him over with a steamroller. Cal shrugged. Karis took one look at her and disappeared in tendrils of black smoke and shadows. She found that creepy. Or maybe she found him creepy. There was something seriously wrong with him. He hadn't shown an ounce of pain when they had been fighting. "It isn't what you think." Cal rubbed the towel over his chest, his very bare chest. She diligently kept her eyes off it. If she looked at it, she would start thinking about that moment in the kitchen again, and then she would be blushing. She was beginning to hate how easily he made her blush. Cass had told her once that she had a terrible poker face and let everything she felt show. Did that mean Cal was aware of how attractive she found him? She hoped not. "We were just blowing off steam. We do it all the time." He tossed the towel onto the bench and planted his hands on his trim hips. and she swore he was doing it on purpose, trying to lure her gaze down to his body. She wasn't going to blush. He was just a very good-looking man that she happened to find appealing. It was perfectly natural, and he wasn't the first man she had found attractive. She could speak to him like an adult, without blustering and getting nervous.
I'm not sure Karis was blowing off steam.
He's always like that. Takes a lot to squeeze an emotion out of him. I secretly think Dad just cloned himself and passes Karis off as his firstborn son. She had a flash of a pale, impossibly tall man wearing black armor, a crimson cloak, and a black-horned crown. Cal's father, she presumed. The similarities between him and Karis were striking. The only emotion she could distinctly remember witnessing in Karis had been anger, and that was the only emotion she recalled that man revealing to her as well. A lot of anger. Miranda rubbed her temples, not really listening to Cal, as another killer headache built like a thunderstorm in her head. I need to hit the shower. I probably stink. He moved past her. Another flash of the blood-soaked street hit her. She stood among the carnage, satisfaction rolling through her as she surveyed the battlefield, a glorious sight to behold. Bile blazed up Miranda's throat. She needed some air. She spotted a door off to her right and hurried in that direction into a dimly lit room. She passed straight through it to a set of twin doors and pushed them open, relieved to find them unlocked. She gulped down air as evening light washed over her. It was crisp, soothing. She filled her lungs with it, purging that lingering taste of blood. She wasn't sure how long she stood there on the patio of the small, elegant garden, basking in the fading light, focused on breathing to rid herself of the black urge to not only find the men who had killed her father and hand them over to the police, serving them justice. She wanted to kill them. Faint stars pricked the darkening sky, and she drifted among them, hoping to shake that feeling, needing to shake it. She wasn't a killer. Here you are. She stiffened and pivoted to face Cal where he stood in the doorway, dressed in a black t-shirt and jeans, his wet hair pulled back into a ponytail. His blue eyes turned wary as he looked at her, as he eased off the step and slowly approached her, as if she was a cornered, petrified animal. She felt as if she was one.
I'm going out of my mind.
She barked out a laugh, and her face crumpled as she looked up the towering height of the townhouse. Her father had told her to be strong and have faith, but how could she do that when she was still spinning, when she was feeling things that just weren't her, wanting things that weren't like her? She slowly shook her head, wrapped her arms around herself, and rubbed her hands down her biceps to keep the chill off them. How could she have faith and be strong when all her life her father had been holding things back, keeping her in the dark? He hadn't trusted her, and that hurt. She lowered her eyes to Cal. His were open and honest, beckoning her, drawing her to him again, filling her with the sensation that he wanted her to talk to him. God, she wanted to talk to him. She needed to talk to someone, confide in someone, trust someone.
I feel caged here.
Her gaze flickered to the pale stone building behind him.
I'm going out of my mind. I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm angry my father kept things from me, and I feel as if I'm drowning in it all. I feel as if I can't breathe.
I know exactly how you feel. His solemn tone and the brief flare of pain that lit his blue eyes told her he wasn't just saying that, not like many people would have in an attempt to make her feel better. He meant it. He held his hand out to her, smiled softly, rolled his fingers in a way that tempted her to take his hand and take a leap by trusting him. I have the perfect medicine for you. Chapter 14. The perfect medicine that Cal had prescribed hadn't been what Miranda had anticipated, but as she began to relax, she had to admit it was thrilling, freeing. She sat with her arms around Cal's waist, her front pressed to his spine, his warmth seeping into her to keep the chill of the evening air off her skin, together with the black leather jacket he had given her. Wind rushed against her, cutting around Cal as he gently eased the motorbike through the traffic on the Champs-Élysées. At first, she hadn't wanted to ride a contraption that looked like a death trap to her, a sleek black motorcycle with golden detailing, mostly because it looked as if it would be more at home on a racing track than a road. But it hadn't taken Cal long to cajole her into giving it a go, and into trusting him. His hand came down on hers where they locked over his stomach, not the first reassuring touch he had given her since they had set out from the townhouse. This time his hand lingered, warming hers, filling her with heat that had her relaxing further, pressing closer. She mourned the loss of the feel of his skin against hers as he removed his hand and navigated the bike around a taxi, cutting across the lanes to the slower side of the traffic. Lights chased over her, illuminating the trees that lined the broad street, and she took to watching the world fly by as she found the courage to rest her cheek against his back. He responded by easing back on the throttle, slowing the bike down until they were going at a leisurely pace, something she doubted he did very often. He liked fast bikes, had confessed he had a collection of them in London when he had disappeared on her and returned with this one, managing to teleport it to her. This was more her style. She wasn't into taking risks, and motorcycles had always looked like a dangerous form of transport to her, especially when she was riding one without a helmet. Although with Cal in contact with her, she felt safe perched on the back of his bike. He had assured her that if anything happened, he could step with her, which was apparently what he and his brothers called teleporting. It had definitely had the desired effect on her, getting her onto the back of his bike for a ride through Paris. She watched the stores flying past, the people as they came and went along the busy pavements, and soaked up the feel of Cal against her, how his hand came back to hers, covering it again, holding it. She didn't stop him when he slipped his fingers between hers and curled them over. Didn't fight how good it made her feel. She didn't feel even a hint of nerves as he held her hand. The first man to do such a thing. Or not a man, a god of the underworld. But that didn't frighten her. They weren't so different. According to her father, she came from that world too. Cal squeezed her hand. She lifted her head and he jerked his toward something in front of him, sliding her a sideways look at the same time. Miranda looked there. Ahead of them, the golden Arc de Triomphe stood proud against the dark sky, the trees that lined the avenue seemingly guiding her gaze towards it. It was beautiful. She smiled when Cal looked at her, nestled closer to him, and tried not to think about the fact his hips were between her thighs. He smiled right back at her, and her belly fluttered. He was handsome, despite the bruises and some cuts that were still healing after his fight, and now that his Joker facade was beginning to fall away, she was starting to find it hard to deny the heat that had swept through her blood, igniting it with a powerful need. He shifted his focus back to the road in front of him, allowing her to study his face at her leisure, without feeling embarrassed about it. He was a contradiction, and the more layers she peeled away, the more attracted to him she became. Cal guided the bike around the Arc de Triomphe, doing a full lap and then another one. She had never been around it before. She had been to it and she had been up it, but she had never circled it like this, able to see it from so many different angles and study it in full from a distance that allowed her to pick out all the details in the delicate carving of the statues. She was about to settle her cheek against Cal's back again and soak in the view, when a sharp sensation shot down her spine and she stiffened. That weird instinct she now possessed had her looking over her shoulder, sure that someone was there. Cal must have felt it too, because he did the same. He cursed low. Demons. He released her hand and squeezed hers together. Hang on tight. She locked her hands tightly around his waist and pressed against him. The second he released her, the engine of the bike roared and they lurched forwards, speeding across the lanes of traffic towards one of the busy roads heading away from the monument. "They following?" Calistos hollered as the wind buffeted them and parked cars streamed past them. Miranda wasn't sure what she was looking for. She glanced back, and it turned out she didn't need to worry about not knowing how to spot a demon. But she really did have to worry about the two human-looking men on motorcycles that were chasing them down, flanking a black Mercedes SUV.
Yes, they're following.
She couldn't believe she was about to say this.
Can you go faster?
Baby, I can leave fire in my trail on this bike. He gunned the engine and she shrieked as they suddenly accelerated, the gap between them and the demons growing. She didn't want to know how fast they were going, but apparently it wasn't fast enough. The two on bikes sped towards them, gaining again. Her eyes widened as something caught the streetlights, drawing her gaze up.
Cal?
She breathed, unable to believe what she was seeing.
Can demons fly?
Because it looked a heck of a lot like there were two scaly humanoid things with wings chasing them too. Ah, fuck. Cal swerved around a car and back again, cutting past traffic. She flinched and burrowed against his back as they sped across an intersection and car headlights came at her. Cal hit the throttle again, the bike lunging forwards just as a car closed in on her. It cut past the back of the bike, blaring its horn at them.
Are you insane?
She wanted to slap his back, but was too afraid of falling to remove her hands from his waist. I can outrun them. Cal just rode faster, his reflexes amazing as he dodged and weaved, slipped the bike through the heavy traffic, riding the damn thing like he had stolen it. She wasn't immortal, not that she knew anyway. Karis had healed that cut so quickly, and Cal was healing fast too. Any time she had injured herself, it had taken her days to heal it just like a human. She didn't think she would survive if they crashed into any of the cars. She could see it all playing out before her eyes, how she would tumble like a rag doll across the tarmac, braking so easily. How a car would probably mow her down and finish her off. A scream burst from her lips as they narrowly avoided being hit by a car as it cut across the lanes. The high roar of the engine and the wind that deafened her as it blasted against her did nothing for her nerves either. She wanted to squeeze her eyes shut, deciding she didn't want to see what was happening, but she couldn't stop staring at every car they whizzed past, or the demons who were hot on their heels, weaving their bikes through the traffic with the same skill as Cal. Her gaze drifted up. The winged fiends were somehow closing in on them, creatures that no one else on the street seemed to see. Cal sped onto another intersection. Car horns blared as his left arm slammed against her ribs, forcing her to lean right. She had only a split second to react before he was turning the bike at a sharp angle, his knee coming down and almost grazing the road. She leaned right, desperately countering the weight of the bike. A silent scream lodged in her throat. The bike fishtailed as he straightened out, the back wheel kicking left and right. Miranda clung to him and did scream this time, right down his ear so he knew how close she had been to having a heart attack. She mentally crossed herself several times as Cal sped down the new road, a narrower one with less traffic on it. I gotcha, not letting anything happen to you. Cal's words were muffled by the wind, but she caught them all, and the way he briefly touched her hand had her pulse slowing down again to a less terrifying speed, because she was clinging to a god, one who had proven he was in control of this death machine and who could whisk her away if something did happen. He would protect her. They following? Cal asked. Miranda looked back over her shoulder, gasped as she stared straight into the glowing yellow eyes of the demon directly to her left. She squeezed Cal's waist so hard he grunted as the demon made a lunge for her. Cal swore under his breath and kicked his left leg out, slamming his booted foot into the demon's bike. The demon careened into a parked car, and she stared in horror as the bike kicked up, sending the male flying into the air. They're after you. Cal's deep voice had a shocked note to it, because he had thought he was their target. Why are so many demons after you?
I told you, I don't know.
She pressed closer to Cal's back, her eyes on the second demon as he raced to catch up with them.
My father kept my mother hidden, and he kept me hidden too.
Cal cursed. You could have mentioned that earlier. Hadn't she? She felt sure she had explained everything, telling him that her father had helped hide her mother and had kept her secret. Maybe she hadn't. Now wasn't the time to sweat the small stuff. The demon and his flying fiends were closing in, and she had no clue where the SUV had gone. She braced herself as the demon on the bike leaned forwards and revved the engine, roaring towards her. Her heart accelerated again, rushing in her ears as adrenaline spiked in her veins. Cal growled and rode faster to counter him, but it wasn't enough. The demon reached for her. Miranda was damned if he was going to snatch her. She twisted Cal's t-shirt into her fist, locked her left arm around his waist, and sent up a prayer as she swatted at the man with her right hand. He swerved and dodged her weak blow, dropped back but remained close enough that he could make another attempt. She wasn't brave enough to kick him, not as Cal had. Her thighs were clenched tight against his hips, fiercely gripping him and the bike. The dark-haired man narrowed vivid ice-blue eyes on her, his cat-like pupils thin lines in the centers of his irises. Cal swerved around one car and threaded the bike between two more, forcing the demon to drop further back. She breathed a little easier as she kept an eye on the man, watching him fall back to at least 20 feet behind her, a distance she could live with. The two flying things didn't give her a chance to relax, though. They swooped in tandem and she ducked as they swiped at her, narrowly avoiding their claws. They collided, hissing at each other and flashing twin rows of sharp teeth. "Fuck off!" Cal barked, and suddenly the demon shot upwards, tumbling head over heels, swept high into the air. She had been right about him. He could control the air around them. Something latched onto her right arm. Pulled. Miranda clung to Cal with her left hand and wrestled with the demon on the motorbike, trying to dislodge him. "Ditch him! I'm getting us out of here!" Cal hollered, as if it was that easy. The demon held fast, refusing to release her no matter how fiercely she struggled. She pulled her arm towards her body, tugging him with her, and his bike wobbled beneath him. He fought to control it with his free hand as he yanked on her arm, almost ripping her off the back of Cal's bike. She wasn't going to escape him, not unless she gave it her all. It was him or her. Her stomach twisted at the thought of doing what Cal had done to the other demon, nerves rising to get the better of her. She vanquished them and kicked out at his bike as she pulled her arm in again and twisted it upwards. His grip slipped as the bike lunged and the front wheel spun out, and she broke free of him as Cal swerved left. Her heart stopped as the demon careened into an oncoming vehicle and was flung through the air before hitting the tarmac, and bouncing across it, his arms and legs flying in all directions. Tires screeched and she flinched away as a van hit him. Sickness washed through her as she buried her face against Cal's back. Another kill for her tally. "You did what you had." Cal's words cut off as they hit an intersection. Time slowed as the black SUV came from her right, cutting straight across them. Cal jerked the bike to the left. The side of the SUV came at her. He wasn't going to make it. Silence swept around her, numbness chasing through her as she stared at the vehicle and her reflection in the glossy paint. The front of the bike hit the wing of the car and nothing felt real as she was launched into the air with it and Cal. She sailed through the air, everything upside down, feeling strangely calm. When the world righted itself, she was looking at Cal. Desperation etched hard lines on his face as he stretched a hand out to her. She stared at the yawning distance between her and him as she reached for him, and she realized something. She was going to die. Wind struck her in the back, sending her flying towards him. Below her, the bike exploded in a ball of flames that heated her feet. She looked down at it, staring death in the face. Miranda screamed. Cal's hand snapped around her wrist. Everything went black. Was she dead? She kept on screaming into that dark abyss. "Open your eyes, Miranda." Cal's voice drifted around her, the sweetest thing she had ever heard. "And my ears would thank you if you'd stop screaming, too." She snapped her mouth shut and her eyes open. She wasn't dead. She was standing in the middle of a living room, but not the one she had come to know over the last few days. This one had pale gray walls and was smaller. Her legs shook beneath her as Cal kept hold of her waist. She was grateful for his support, felt sure she would have been on her knees if not for his hands on her hips. The terror that gripped her was slow to abate, had her pulse drumming swiftly as her mind tried to process what had just happened, and one feeling kept rushing through her. She had felt sure she was going to die. And then Cal had saved her, just as he had promised he would if anything happened. She stared at him, the adrenaline roaring in her veins coupling with the realization that she was alive and safe. The heat that blazed through her was too much to contain, incinerating the tethers of her restraint as Cal checked her over, a worried edge to his blue eyes as he inspected every inch of her. "You okay?" He lifted his hand and brushed the wild strands of her blonde hair from her face, clearing her eyes. Miranda leaped at him, wrapped her arms around his neck, and kissed him. He was still for a heartbeat that felt like an agonizing eternity, and then his arms banded around her waist and he lifted her. His mouth seized hers, the heat of it bliss as he claimed control of the kiss. She moaned as he angled his head and his tongue breached her lips, as he kissed her deeper still, with passion that lit her up inside and had that heat burning hotter. She surrendered to it, lost herself in the intense pleasure of his kiss and the need rapidly building inside her. She had never kissed like this before. It was thrilling, intense, incredible. Her back hit the wall and Cal moaned as he dropped his hands to her thighs and wedged himself between them. A wave of tingles pulsed through her as his hips met hers, as he kissed her, chasing away all of her fear. unleashing a side of her that was as thrilling as his kiss. She felt powerful, as if his strength was flowing into her, erasing her inhibitions, awakening need that consumed her, had her pulling him closer and seizing command of the kiss so she could drive him to do more. She wanted more than just this kiss. She wanted all of him. His lips froze against hers, his entire body locking up tight. His whispered words had her tensing with him, cold swiftly replacing the heat of passion. We're not alone. Chapter 15. The room around them wasn't the one Cal had expected to see when he pulled back. He had teleported them to London. Instinct had been in control when he had seen Miranda tumbling through the air. His heart lodged firmly in his throat as fear had gripped him. The thought that he wouldn't be able to save her had pounded in his mind, shaking him. He had teleported the second he had managed to grab her, before the fireball caused by his bike exploding could engulf her. He was glad he had brought her here, away from Paris where she kept being attacked, although she was the first woman to set foot in his home. A trickle of nerves ran through him as he set her on her feet and released her, and her tropical ocean eyes took in the room. Maybe it was actually a good thing Karis had gone on a tidying spree. Her hands clutched his arms as he went to take a step back from her.
Who's here?
He smiled to ease her worry. Just my brother. Cal could feel him in the bedroom to his right, or maybe the bathroom. Miranda slowly released him and he moved aside, giving her some space as she relaxed. He hadn't noticed any injuries on her, but she had been through a lot, had been terrified when the demons had attacked her, trying to take her. He tried to shut out a flashback of her sailing through the air, but while the images faded, the fear remained. How close had he come to losing her tonight? He should have teleported her before that point, shouldn't have let things go that far and become that dangerous. Some foolish part of him had been confident he could outride the demons. The same foolish part of him that had wanted to impress her. He had wanted her to see that he could take care of her, that no matter what happened, she could trust him and rely on him. All he had done was terrify her. He was an idiot. That male need to impress her had almost gotten her killed. He wanted to stop her when she drifted away from him, taking slow steps towards the dark gray couch. He resisted the urge to take hold of her and keep her close to him. She was safe here. Nothing could breach the wards he had set in place around his home, not without him feeling it. He had enough juice left to teleport her away again if necessary. She looked back at him, her gaze locking with his, her kiss-blushed lips rousing the need to take them again and feel them against his. She had responded so beautifully when his brain had kicked into gear, the shock of her kissing him subsiding, allowing him to finally seize the moment and what she had been offering. He cursed Karis for being home. Miranda turned away, her eyes leaping over everything in the room. He waited, weirdly on edge, as she drifted away from him. Her gaze roamed over the TV mounted on the wall above the fireplace, to the two black wingback armchairs that flanked it, and then the bookcase that stood against the wall near the door to the kitchen, singling out the one that contained his collection of DVDs. The other bookcase that stood across the room opposite it held all his books. She couldn't have chosen to look at that one. He expected her to say something negative about how many movies and series he owned, but when she reached the shelves, she plucked one from the shelf and looked at him.
I've seen this one.
She showed him the cover. It was the first season of American Dad. She didn't look as if she judged him negatively for owning a cartoon. In fact, she looked pleased by it.
I liked it.
She set it back on the shelf and her fingers drifted over the spines of the cases. A crinkle formed between her fair eyebrows.
You don't have any friends. I like friends. I always thought perhaps I could have something like that.
She glanced at him, a shy edge to it, and then averted her gaze. He didn't need to be a mind reader like Karis to know she felt embarrassed. There was no need. You don't have many friends. He kicked his boots off and strode across the wooden floor to the back of the couch. Her eyes fell to the clothes tossed on it and then lifted to his. Not mine. Karis is staying here while we were in Paris. And it wasn't like Karis to be this messy. She found a black hairband on a shelf, lifted it, and showed it to him.
Can I?
He nodded, and she gathered her tousled blonde hair and twisted it into a knot she secured with the band. When she was finished, she removed her shoes and neatly placed them at the end of the bookcase.
I've never had many friends. Where I grew up, the children my age always treated me differently because I had no mother. Sometimes they were cruel. I would go home and Papa would cheer me up, and after my homework was done, I would be allowed to watch some television. I loved watching Friends the most. Would imagine I had so many close friends and lived in a world like that, one filled with excitement and interest.
Grew up in a small town? When she looked at him, he added, "It sounds like small town mentality to me. The kids being mean, people not understanding, not being able to find people like you." She frowned down at her feet.
I'm not sure I would have been able to find people like me even if I had grown up in a city.
He wanted to go to her and gather her into his arms whenever she looked like that, caught up in the fact she wasn't human and feeling as if she was alone because of it. He pressed his hands to the back of the couch. "Nah, there's loads of non-humans in cities. And you weren't alone. You had your dad."
He kept things from me.
She closed her eyes. He did go to her now. "He just wanted to keep you safe and protect you. But I get how it feels." He brushed his palm across her cheek, and warmth spread up his arm and condensed in his chest when she leaned into his touch. "My brothers kept some things from me. Important things. It hurt. That's why I was fighting Karis." Her eyes opened and she lifted her head, her gaze fixing on his.
What did they keep from you?
He had the feeling the answer to that was a lot of things, but he settled for talking about the two things he did know about. "I have a condition." He lowered his hand from her face and walked around her to the mantelpiece and the picture that stood in the center of it. Was he really going to do this? He had never talked to a woman, or anyone outside of his family, about his blackouts before, or about his sister, and how he had failed her. But he wanted to tell Miranda about it, about himself. He slipped his fingers under the sky-blue ribbon tied to the corner of the ornate silver frame and let it run over them.
She's beautiful.
Miranda came to stand beside him. He stared at the portrait, at the stupid girl in it who appeared teenage in mortal terms. She had fidgeted and complained every single minute of the time it had taken for the goddess to paint it. When he had told her to keep still and it would be over faster, she had made him promise to take her to the nearest town in exchange for her compliance. Being as desperate as she had been to escape the palace for a while, he had agreed. When they had reached the town, she had made him buy her so many things that he had burned through all the coin he'd had on him, which hadn't been an insubstantial amount. One of the things had been the ribbon, woven from the finest silk in Olympus, a rare find in the underworld, just as she had been. She was my sister, my twin. He stared at the girl, aching inside as he thought about how she would never grow into a woman, and how much he missed her, the other half of him. He hadn't felt whole since the day she had been taken from him. She died a long time ago. She was murdered. It was still hard to say that, and even harder to think about what had happened afterwards. His entire world had fallen apart, and everyone had been distraught when they had learned of what had happened. He had been sure his family was going to fall apart, too, or that everyone would blame him as he deserved. I was there when she was killed. He rubbed his temple with his free hand, trying to ease the pain building in his head, skirting the edge of it so he wouldn't succumb to the crushing pressure of trying to remember what had happened. Miranda's hand came down gently on his where it gripped the frame, and he stared at it, marveled at how the pressure eased a little as she held his hand. With her touching him like that, he felt as if he could push back the darkness and the pain, could possibly face it without fear of passing out. I don't remember what happened. It's best I don't remember. If I try to recall it, or if a memory of that time comes to me, I black out. He cast her a look he knew was bleak, one that would allow her to see the depth of the pain he carried, a bottomless pit of it that he felt sure would never heal. When I come around, I forget what happened. It's like the last 5, 10, or 20 minutes never existed. Whatever triggered the blackout is gone, together with whatever I remembered. A solemn look entered her eyes.
You forget the terrible things that happened to you, and I forget the terrible things I've done to others.
He swept the back of his fingers across her cheek, hoping to chase the pain from her eyes. We're not so different. We both forget the terrible things we did. We both wish we hadn't done them. Her death was my fault. I shouldn't have encouraged her to be like me. A reckless idiot. When I discovered she had followed me, I should have done something different. Found a way to get her home faster or contact my parents somehow.
You couldn't teleport her?
He shook his head. During my rite of passage, I didn't have that power. Father put all of us boys through it, taking us to a far corner of the underworld where he couldn't see clearly, one we had to work our way home from. It was a test, designed to help our powers awaken and hone what skills we had, transforming us into warriors worthy of his name. No one had known Calendria would follow me. Her thumb stroked the back of his fingers.
It wasn't your fault.
It was, and nothing anyone could say would ever make him feel different. When my family eventually found us, they were too late to save her. I remember I had tried to keep her safe. I remember fighting. I remember snippets, bits and pieces of other things, terrible things. But I don't remember who tortured us and who killed her. He drew down a deep, shuddering breath and fought for calm as pain raked fiery claws over his mind. He wasn't going to pass out because he wasn't going to try to remember, no matter how badly he wanted to do just that. He just had to keep breathing. When Father demanded I tell him what happened, I tried and blacked out. I woke days later that time. He tried to probe my memories, but he found nothing, just a void. It wasn't a void in his mind, though. He knew that. It was a wall. Layers and layers of one designed to lock those dreadful memories away because he couldn't bear the pain they caused him or the thought that she was gone. Other gods and goddesses tried to break my mind open and only succeeded in breaking me. Mother demanded they stopped, that my father stopped. She didn't want to lose another child. Losing Calendria had almost killed her. Ever since then, I've had to live with how I failed my sister. How her soul and her body had been separated and she had been left adrift, unable to go to the Elysian fields. I've had to live with the fact I can't even bring her killers to justice. He stroked his fingers down the glass covering her portrait as fire burned in his veins like lava, and the darker side of his nature, the part that came from Hades' blood, gnashed its teeth. But now I can. He looked deep into Miranda's soft eyes. My brothers kept it from me. The answer. The people who killed my sister. They killed your father, too. Black ringed her irises as they turned violet. Cal clutched her hand, gripping it tightly. We'll find them, Miranda. They will pay for what they've done to us, to our families. She nodded stiffly, sorrow filling her eyes as she looked up at him, the violet slowly fading back to tropical blue. It shifted back again as she muttered,
You were right to be angry with your brothers. They shouldn't have kept things from you.
She was hurting, and he was man enough to admit that he was hurting too, still stung by what his brothers had done, even though he understood why they had done it. Believe me, I'm mad at them, but, he sighed. But maybe it was the right move. I refer you back to the part where I mentioned I'm reckless. I want to find these people and slaughter them, but doing that won't bring my sister back. In fact, it would only make things worse. When a furrow formed between her eyebrows, confusion mixed with curiosity filling her eyes, he heaved another sigh. One of the men, a necromancer apparently, knows where her soul is. That means her soul is intact, or at least I can finally dare to hope that it is. If her soul is intact and we can find it, my father could guide it to the Elysian fields.
The Elysian fields?
He nodded. It's a beautiful place, lush and green. The good souls go there. Tears lined her lashes, ripping at him, rousing a fierce need to comfort her.
Do you think Papa went there?
Cal didn't hesitate to nod. He was a carrier, so he had blood of the underworld in his veins, or at least the blood of the Olympians, and he took care of you and your mother. He protected you both, and loved you both. I'm sure his soul is resting there now, at peace. although it was probably worried still. Souls that entered that realm weren't freed of their feelings. Cal swept the back of his fingers across her pale cheek. Her father didn't need to fret. Cal would take care of her in his stead, protecting her from whatever the fates had in store for her. Look at me screwing up taking care of you again. You're probably still freaked out about what happened. She surprised him by shaking her head.
I feel weirdly fine. That isn't normal, is it?
He hiked his shoulders. Sounds pretty normal to me. Didn't take me long to get used to finding myself in dangerous situations. It's like a gear you switch into when you're under threat. Some emotions get shut down to protect yourself and others turn on.
But you're a warrior.
He cupped her cheek and brushed his thumb over it. You're a warrior too. You just never knew it. Whatever your mother was, she must have come from a breed with fighting instincts, which doesn't narrow it down much. There's a lot of species in the underworld with warrior blood like that. She didn't look as if his words were at all comforting, her pretty face shifting towards solemn again as her eyes gained a wary and thoughtful edge. Come on. I'll fix you a cup of herbal tea and we can talk some more about all the species in the underworld that might fit you. He slipped his hand into hers and tugged her past the bookcase of DVDs to the door just beyond it.
I'd like that,
she whispered. If it took all night, he would tell her about all the species he could think of, giving her details about a world she had never known, but one she was definitely a part of. He pushed the door open and stepped into the oak kitchen, Miranda trailing behind him. Stopped dead. He stared at the discarded shirt on the floor as the coppery stench of demon blood hit him.
That smell.
Miranda covered her mouth, her eyes enormous. He squeezed her hand as her fear trickled into him. It's old blood. No demons here. We're safe. She nodded, but the panic in her eyes remained, together with something else. Guilt? Despair? He wasn't sure what it was. She didn't like the things she had done, even though it had been demons she had killed and she had been defending herself. Maybe it was fear of herself he had sensed in her. She didn't understand her instincts, so she was afraid of them, feeling as if she was two souls in one body, or that something was inside her. The darkness that came from his father's blood sometimes felt as if something had set up home in him, so he could understand her worry and fear. He had learned to live with it, but it had taken him most of his 765 years. And every now and again he still felt as if it was another force within him, one that easily controlled him at times, one that seemed to be coming to the fore frequently since Miranda had come into his life. He glanced at her, her fear a constant on his senses, rousing that dark side of himself that burned with a need to protect her, to shield her and keep her safe. Keep her his. His sharp senses charted the house, locating and fixing on Karis where he was in his bedroom, and the darkness snarled, baring teeth because he didn't want his brother near her. No wonder his brothers had all been on edge when they had met their women, or were still on edge even now. Sometimes Ares still looked as if he wanted to kill anyone who so much as glanced at Megan. He looked at Miranda, studying her, drinking his fill of her beauty as it calmed his raging darker side. It struck him that he didn't want fast and fun. Not with her. He wasn't ready for this, couldn't shake the feeling that if he allowed himself to grow closer to her, if he let himself fall for her, that he would only end up losing her. He would do something to get her killed too. He released her hand, needing a moment to breathe, and crouched by the black shirt. He carefully lifted it, grimacing as the disgusting scent of demon blood grew stronger, the black liquid dripping from the material to leave a puddle on his wooden floor, which was probably ruined now. He was going to have to tear it all up to get rid of the smell. His brother must have gone out demon hunting straight after their fight. He took the shirt to the waste bin and tossed it into it, turned away to head back through the living room to go and check on Karis. Froze as his gaze caught on his brother's phone on the black marble top of the island, next to a small obsidian box. Curiosity got the better of him, even as the tiny sensible part of him said that Karis would be furious if he caught him snooping.
What's that?
Miranda said as he lifted the rectangular cold stone box from the counter. Don't know. Cal eased the lid open with his thumb, stared at the tiny black pills it contained. What the fuck do you think you're doing? Karis stormed into the room, snatched the box from him, and clutched it in his fist. His green eyes burned black as he towered over Cal, the fury emanating from him in powerful waves hitting Cal, as he tried to think of a way to talk his way out of this mess, because Karis cursing was never a good sign. Cal braced himself, sure that Karis was about to utterly destroy him, but then his brother's bare shoulders tensed and his black gaze slid towards Miranda. "What happened?" Those words were calm, his tone even, as if he hadn't just been on the verge of obliterating Cal. Controlled. His brother was still seething. Cal had known him long enough to spot the tells. He could act as if nothing was wrong all he wanted, but Karis was mad at him. Because Cal had discovered a dirty little secret? What were those pills? More importantly, what the hell was his brother doing standing so close to Miranda when he was only wearing a small towel around his hips? Cal stepped in front of her, a low growl curling up his throat. "Put some damned clothes on and we'll talk. In fact, I think we all need to be in on this meeting, including Miranda. If he was going to Tokyo, then she was too. He needed to know that she was safe." Karis huffed and stepped, leaving faint ribbons of darkness in his wake. Cal released the breath he had been holding, relaxing a notch as his brother distanced himself, not only from Cal but from Miranda. He pulled his phone from his pocket and was about to fire off a group message when one rolled in. From Merrick.
What is it?
Miranda clutched his shoulders and tried to peer over them, her breasts pressing against his back and threatening to distract him. He showed her the screen. "Merrick has the CCTV footage." Chapter 16. Cal took hold of Miranda's hand and stepped with her to Tokyo, landing on the porch of the elegant ancient single-story mansion. Her wide eyes danced around her, her shock rippling into him as she turned in a slow semicircle, keeping her grip on his hand.
We're in...
She trailed off as she glanced back at him, a beautiful look of disbelief on her face. "Japan." He scrubbed a hand around the back of his neck. "It's kinda our stronghold."
It's incredible.
She started to drift away from him down the step into the formal front garden. Cal kept hold of her hand, stopping her from hitting the path that wound between ancient stone lanterns, cutting through the pale gravel that surrounded perfectly manicured topiary, to head towards the imposing gatehouse and the cherry and maple trees that occupied the corners of the garden, shading grassy areas. She looked back at him, early morning bathing her in golden light that threaded highlights in her hair and brightened her blue eyes. Her eyes widened further and she stepped back, tugging him down onto the path with her as her gaze danced over the mansion. He knew what she was seeing, and it was probably a shock to her system. The mansion was centuries old, quintessentially Japanese with its sweeping ribbed gray-tiled roof and thick dark wooden beams, and the white-paneled walls that filled the spaces between them. A startling contrast to the modern world she was used to. "Everyone should be here soon." He stepped closer to her and fixed his senses on her to monitor her feelings. "All of my brothers. You don't have to worry about them, okay? You're safe here with us." She nodded, not an ounce of nerves in her.
Phew, that doesn't get easier,
Megan said as she appeared with Ares on the stone path beyond Miranda. Miranda whirled to face her so fast she almost fell, her pulse off the scale as her hand tensed against Cal's.
Oh,
Megan's warm brown eyes widened.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. I thought we would be the first here.
Ares slung his arm around her slender shoulders, his black shirt appearing grim against her autumnal orange woolen jumper. His brother grinned, a sickening amount of love in his eyes as Megan absently ran a hand over her belly. The bump on her belly. She was showing.
You're pregnant.
Miranda sounded surprised by that. Or maybe it was the 1-2 punch of there being another woman attending the meeting and the fact that the woman was pregnant.
17 weeks and counting.
Megan beamed as she patted her belly. Ares continued to grin like an idiot, his dark eyes bright with flecks of gold and red fire. Or maybe his brother was just proud. Miranda relaxed a notch and then another as Megan broke free of his brother's grip and came to her, looping an arm around hers and stealing her from Cal.
I bet you just can't wait to enter this madness that is the family home.
Megan smiled at Miranda. Cal grimaced as Escher's voice rang out in the morning air as if on cue. "No shoes in the house." Cal could imagine Valen flipping his brother off as he snapped, "Bite me." The front door opened. Valen grumbled something at Megan and tossed his boots onto the rack on the wooden porch. "Better?" he barked over his shoulder. "What's got your panties in a bunch anyway?"
Esha does not wear panties.
Aiko's soft voice, her English stilted as she struggled with it, had Cal shaking his head and chuckling. He knew exactly how Valen was going to respond to that one. "That's what you know. I bet he's wearing your panties right now." Escher snarled, the black sound carrying a warning. Valen was pushing him too hard. Aries heaved a long sigh, strode past Megan as Miranda helped her with her trainers, and kicked his boots off. He picked up Valen's pair and carried them into the single-story house. Cal caught a glimpse of Aries shoving them at their brother. "Go pick up Eva. I can't stand you when you're not around her." Aries didn't need to tell Valen twice. Valen stepped without his boots and reappeared a moment later, cradling Eva in his arms like a princess. The black and blue-haired assassin swatted at him, biting out curses in Italian as she tried to break free of his arms. He silenced her with a hard kiss. Miranda cast her gaze down at her feet, and a hint of color climbed her cheeks. Was she thinking about their kiss? He had been thinking about it every second since it had happened, trying to figure out a way to make it happen again. Miranda removed her own shoes and placed them neatly beside Megan's on the rack. It was already getting full, and there were at least 3 more people due to show up. Escher was going to have to get a bigger rack at this rate. Cal toed off his boots and followed Miranda and Megan inside. Eva eventually twisted free of Valen, dropping to her feet in a low crouch. She popped up and smiled at Megan.
You're coming along.
Eva looked as out of place against Megan's colorful jumper and blue jeans as Aries did. Not that he could talk. He tended to wear black most of the time, too. Although Eva was wearing fatigues and a fitted black jacket that bulged at the sides, indicating she was armed. Her bright blue eyes landed back on Valen.
I really do want to catch up with everyone, but I have a job to do.
Which was crappy code for she had someone to kill. Valen made no secret of the fact he hated that she was still taking work as an assassin, complained about it whenever she had to skip a meeting. Apparently, he didn't like being forced to be one of the loners who didn't have a woman. "You're staying." Valen snaked his arm around her waist, and she fought him as he pulled her towards him. "For me. Come on, pretty please. I'll make it worth your while." She surrendered, her eyes gaining a wicked light as her lips curled into the semblance of a smile. Valen tugged her against him and kissed her again. "Gross," Megan muttered, earning a surprised look from Aries. Her eyebrows rose.
It's not me talking, it's the baby.
"Come here, sweetheart." Aries ruffled her dark hair, cupped her nape, and kissed her, a sweet one that was a stark contrast to the vulgar tonsil tennis happening between Valen and Eva. Cal glanced at Miranda. She had a strange glow in her eyes, a light he had never seen before. Was she happy? His family were all shades of weird, and most of the time they annoyed the hell out of him, but there was never a dull moment. He itched with a need to take hold of her hand and kiss her like Aries was kissing Megan, but tamped it down. He couldn't fall for her. Everyone he loved ended up dying. It was the reason he kept things light, kept things easy and forgettable. He couldn't remember the last time he had slept with someone more than once, and he definitely couldn't remember ever falling in love. And life was better that way. It was better that he left when people got too close to him. It was better if he ditched and ran if things got too serious. He lowered his gaze to Miranda. Wasn't it? He could still taste their kiss. Couldn't deny that she had him tied in knots, and that he wanted to kiss her again. Ached to take things to the next level. Even when he feared once would never be enough for him, and if he surrendered to the attraction that burned between them, she would be branded on him forever. On his heart. Someone shoved him in the back. He jerked forwards and glared over his shoulder at Merrick. His brother's earthy eyes sparkled with amusement. "Zoning out there, Cal. Wonder what you could be thinking about." Katerina tucked her wavy caramel hair behind her ear, and her hazel eyes glimmered with mischief.
But I know what he is thinking about.
She was a bad influence on Merrick. He had been the solid, dependable, and serious type before he had fallen in love with her. Now he was cracking jokes, and it was freaking Cal out. Merrick brought his girl fiend with him. Valen finally stopped kissing Eva and grinned at his brother, his golden eyes flashing as he shifted them to Katerina. I hope he fed you properly. Katerina blushed hard, but banked heat filled her eyes, and every man in the room, including Cal, groaned as a sweet scent filled it. Cal's head went a little dizzy, warmth blooming in his veins, and that urge to kiss Miranda grew as Katerina's succubus side rose to the fore. Tamp it down, Ares grunted, leveling a glare on Katerina and then Merrick. Think she needs a top-up. Clearly you failed in your task to satisfy her this time. I can give you some pointers. For a moment, Merrick looked as if he was going to flip Ares off, but then his scowl eased and he wrapped an arm around Katerina's shoulders and guided her past Cal, leading her across the golden tatami mats to the corridor beyond the TV area on the right of the long open-plan room. That was them gone for a few minutes at least, as long as it took for Merrick to satisfy Katerina's unstable succubus nature and stop her from accidentally releasing pheromones designed to drug and lure all men in the vicinity into submission. Cal avoided meeting Karis's gaze as he appeared on the porch beside him and stepped back to give him room to pass. He glanced off to his left. Diamond stood on the path to the house, flanked by two huge stone lanterns, running his gloved hand over the soft spikes of his white hair. His pale blue eyes held conflict that Cal could feel in him as he stared at the doorway. What had his brother so reluctant to enter? Diamond had been acting up for the last few weeks. Cal had asked if something was wrong, but he had brushed him off, so Cal had tried Escher instead. The two were close, shared a bond that was strong enough to pull Escher back from the brink whenever his other side tried to seize control. But even Escher wasn't sure what was wrong with Diamond. Something was definitely bothering him, though. He had never been this distant. Merrick had put it down to Megan's pregnancy, and Cal could see why. Diamond had been drawing away from them ever since she had announced it, and Diamond shared Ares' problem. His power had manifested when they had come to the mortal world, meaning he couldn't have physical contact with anyone without potentially killing them with his ice. Was seeing Ares able to touch Megan, to have a life with her, taking its toll on Diamond? Hey, man. Cal stepped onto the porch. Been a while. Diamond noticed him and slipped his hands into the pockets of his black jeans, but Cal didn't miss the frost that glittered on his leather gloves. You good? Cal canted his head. As I've ever been, Diamond muttered and walked towards him, kicked his boots off and eased around Cal, careful not to make contact with him. Cal looked down at the frosty footprints on the path. Good his arse. Karis wasn't the only one in a bad mood today. Cal stepped into the house and closed the door behind him. Everyone had moved into the sitting area to his right, the two cream couches already full. Ares sat at one end of the couch that faced the enormous flat-screen television Megan balanced on his lap. Next to him, Escher did the same with Aiko, holding her as she talked to Megan. Miranda had pulled up a footstool near them, nerves showing on her face as she spoke with them, but there was that glimmer of something akin to happiness, too. He figured it out as he looked at the room and thought about how things had been when they had arrived, and recalled what she had said to him in London. She had always wanted to experience a real-life friend scenario. His family were crazy, stuff was always happening, and the place was usually buzzing whenever they all came together. He guessed to her they were a wacky version of Friends, the immortal edition. Diamond slumped into the spot beside Escher, a weary sigh escaping him that pulled a concerned glance from Escher. Escher briefly touched Diamond's knee and whispered something. Diamond nodded, forced a smile. Karis came to stand between the two couches. Thankfully, his brother had taken the time to dress before coming to Tokyo. Miranda had been seeing far too much of his brother's body for Cal's liking. At the end of the second couch nearest him, Valen had Eva tucked close to him and was still kissing her. Katerina scurried out of the corridor beyond the couches, adjusting her dark sweater, and Merrick casually followed on her heels, a hazy edge to his dark eyes that made Cal want to shudder. Too much information. He didn't want to think about his brothers having sex, let alone about them having sex when he was only a few feet away in the same house as them. Katerina sat beside Eva, and Merrick eased onto the seat beside her and set about hooking up his laptop to the television. Cal rounded the couches to Miranda and nudged her so he could sit beside her. Their hips pressed together, and he felt her nerves, saw it in her eyes as she glanced at him. This wasn't going to be easy for her. It wasn't going to be easy for him either. Not now that he knew the wraith had killed his sister. He shut everyone out as he slipped his hand into hers and held it, focusing on her and only her. He didn't need to see the looks his brothers would be exchanging. He was just offering her comfort and stealing a little for himself as well. The television flickered with an image. Merrick muttered a curse, did something, and the static cleared to reveal a garden. Miranda's hand tensed in his. Cal squeezed it gently. "We'll get them, I swear." She nodded, but it was stiff as she stared at the TV. Sure enough, just as she had said, a car pulled up and two men got out. The quality of the image dipped, turning pixelated, but when it cleared up again, there was no mistaking one of the men. "Well, there's our answer," Ares said. "It's definitely the wraith." Cal's blood burned as he stared at the wraith. It was him, Eli, the bastard who had been within his reach more than once, and Cal hadn't known how close he had been to Calindria's killer. His pulse picked up pace as he glared at the screen, the darkness within him seething with a need to track him down and kill him. Miranda was right. Eli needed to pay for his sins, and Cal was going to be the one to do it.
"The one in the long black coat, he never leaves. He can teleport like you?"
She looked at him. Cal shook his head. "Eli can create portals," Karis said for him. "We think there might be a limit to how many times he can do it, but we don't know. He's a dangerous demon."
"A demon," she whispered. "Like those ones I killed? Like the ones who were after me last night in Paris?"
Sent by him. Cal couldn't take his eyes off the wretch. He had taken Calindria from him, and now he wanted to take Miranda from him too. Well, it wasn't going to happen. Eli was as good as dead. The next time Cal saw him, he was going to kill him. He pulled back on the reins of his temper. He couldn't let it control him. As much as he wanted Eli dead, he needed to know where he had put Calindria's soul. Then and only then could he make Eli pay for what he had done.
"Wait,"
Megan snapped and pushed forwards onto Ares' knees.
"Go back."
Miranda's hand tensed so hard against Cal's that his bones ached. He looked at her, watched the violet blooming in her eyes as they narrowed on the television, and swore he could feel the rage building inside her. The same black need for revenge that was building inside him.
"No, more."
Megan pushed to her feet. Ares grabbed her arm and shoved to the edge of the couch. "Calm down, sweetheart."
"There."
Megan pointed at the screen and turned to look down at Ares.
"I know him. I've seen him before. The Gate, New York. The first time I saw it, he was there."
A chill skated over Cal's arms as he looked at her, and the air in the room grew thick, heavy with silence that pressed down on him. "You're sure?" Karis said. Megan nodded, her eyes never leaving Ares.
"I'm sure. I remember everything about that night. The gate was so beautiful, amazing. When it opened, the one who stepped out, it was him. He had golden eyes, and I remember thinking they were incredible."
Ares growled. She cuffed him around the head.
"Not incredible like that. I just hadn't seen anything like them."
"So we've been letting this fuck in and out of the underworld for the last 6 months?" Valen bit out. "Try the last gods know how many years," Diamond offered. "And who knows how many others are working with him. He might not be the only hellspawn involved." "All this time right under our noses." Ares' voice scraped low, a snarl to it as he scowled at the TV. "He's probably been meeting with the demons on this side of the gates, feeding them intelligence, or recruiting powerful people in the underworld. But at least we have a face to go on now." Karis was the only one who didn't sound ready to rip this guy apart. "And we know he's in this world and stuck here thanks to Father closing the gates to all necromancer traffic, assuming he is the necromancer. Father will be pleased to know he isn't in the underworld if it turns out he is one. We just need to find a way to confirm it. Any suggestions?" "Other than hunting him down and butchering the fucker," Valen snapped. Karis gave him a look that said that wasn't a helpful suggestion. Cal looked at the screen, wanting to see his face too. Froze. Darkness hit him like a tidal wave, and he erupted from the seat. tore the laptop from Merrick's hands and roared as he ripped it apart and hurled the pieces across the room. He staggered around Merrick as his brother stared at him in horror, collapsed to his knees on the other side of the couch as the pain blazing across his skull became too much. The abyss beckoned. Cal fought it, refusing to succumb to it. He stoked the rage, the raw fury that demanded vengeance, that screamed at him to unleash every drop of what he was feeling on the owner of those golden eyes.
Cal!
Miranda was by his side in an instant. Her knees hit the straw tatami mats beside his, and her hand came down on his back as he curled forwards, fighting the abyss that wanted to devour him. Something about her touch allowed him to hold on. It was as if she was drawing all the pain out of him, but pouring it back into him, too. It hit him in agonizing waves, each weaker than the last as he breathed, as her voice swam in his ears, easing him.
What's wrong?
She murmured, genuine concern in her soft voice, spreading warmth through him that kept the cold at bay.
The man!
His voice was hoarse, each word a pain to push out through his tight throat as those golden eyes mocked him, stared at him with contempt. He clutched his head and gritted his teeth, holding himself together, fearing that if he relented for even a moment, that the darkness would claim him and he would forget everything. Miranda gently rubbed his back in soothing circles, coaxing him away from the dark, back towards her light.
You know him too?
He wanted to sob, wanted to break down and thank her for sparing him from having to say that. He cursed how weak he felt, how easily he had been torn down and reduced to nothing. If he couldn't look at a video of the bastard without being pushed to the verge of passing out, his strength stripped from him by pain and misery, how was he meant to face him? Kill him?
Seen him before,
he gritted, aware of the eyes on him, of his brothers surrounding him now as he sat in a fetal position, barely holding himself together, looking like the weak link he really was.
Where?
Karras said, a demand in his voice that had Cal lifting his head, because he couldn't bring himself to say it. The bleak look that filled all of his brothers' eyes said he didn't need to say it for them to know.
What do you remember?
Valen crouched in front of him, a hard look in his golden eyes. Golden eyes that looked too much like that bastard's had. Cal shook his head. He wasn't strong enough to delve, not right now. If he tried, he would end up losing consciousness. It would be too much for him.
Give him room,
Miranda snapped, and whatever look his brothers saw in her eyes, it was deadly enough to have them all backing off a step. Her hand continued to stroke his spine, drawing the pain out of him, pouring strength into him. How did she do that? He wanted to know, because her touch was like black magic. He closed his eyes, sighed as he finally felt on stable ground again. When he opened his eyes and lifted his head to look at his brothers, Merrick held a hand out to him. Cal took it and let his brother pull him onto his feet, and was grateful when Miranda remained close to him, slipped his arm around her shoulders to support him. You owe me a new laptop. Merrick's light and teasing words were at odds with the worry in his dark eyes.
I'm fine.
Cal cast all of his brothers a black look.
Quit looking at me like I'm gonna break or fall apart or something.
Gave us a scare, kid. Valen rubbed his hand over Cal's hair, wrecking it, but Cal didn't call him on it or the fact he was treating him like he was a child again, because his brother was worried about him. They all were.
But hey, little shit held it together this time. That's progress, right?
Valen cast a look at everyone. Diamond and Escher shrugged, but Ares, Merrick, and Karras nodded. Cal was under no illusion that he would have held it together if Miranda hadn't been beside him, working her magic on him, stealing his pain away. Whatever she was powerful. And the man who had tortured him and killed his sister wanted her. To use her against him and his brothers? Was that what her father had foreseen?
I think we have our answer. This man is the necromancer we have been seeking. I will send word to Father. Keep Miranda in London, Karras said, drawing his focus to him. I will take care of Paris again.
Karras stepped, even though the meeting wasn't over.
What's with him recently?
Diamond muttered. Cal wanted to know the same thing, but there was another more pressing thing he needed to know. He turned to Ares.
Karras is taking pills.